Hi everyone, good to see you on my channel today. Today I will tell you a wonderful story. It is full of love and kindness. I hope you enjoy it and I wish you an enjoyable viewing experience. Thank you.
In the heart of the city, among the sights, luxurious flower beds and monuments, there was a prestigious and very expensive hotel. The top of its roof was visible from anywhere in the city, and from the observation deck you could see everything you wished. The surrounding area was always bustling with life. The elite of society settled inside the hotel, and those who did not dream of getting inside took photos of the luxurious facade side. Some just fantasized about getting at least a glimpse inside, and some were disdainful. The rich people there, they think they're aristocrats, some grumbled. Sven had been looking for a new job for a long time. Although he was young, he had a lot of experience in the hotel business. Not without problems, but he was hired at the same hotel as a doorman. Sven was intrigued. Like the rest of the townspeople, he had heard all sorts of rumors and suspicions. And so came his first day of work. Actually, it wasn't exactly his first day of work. Sven had been put on probation under the supervision of a more experienced employee, but his nerves were jittery, as if he was not at work, but at an audience with the president of the country. Donning his uniform, Sven stood at his post. He felt incredibly energized. He wanted to prove himself as soon as possible as an usher. Sven smiled broadly and asked his colleague, what time does the flow of people usually start? His colleague turned out to be a young man named Dan. Like Sven, Dan was a doorman, but he would be leaving that position very soon, having decided to quit. He had been put as Sven's partner to train him. The look on Dan's face was bored and, to put it bluntly, dejected. He shrugged. Whenever Dan muttered. Sven frowned. Dan looked too relaxed. Sure, it was one of his last days on the job. However, the key word here was not last but working. A doorman has no right to be moody. He should be smiling, charming, helpful. And Dan? Dan was more like a security guard at a chain grocery shop in a dormitory neighborhood, not a doorman at a high-end expensive hotel. While the two of them were alone, Sven decided to ask, "What are you doing?" What Dan asked in surprise, leaning against the door. "Why should I be happy? I can't wait to get out of here," he mumbled back. Sven nodded understandingly, though he didn't really understand Dan at all. He couldn't understand how anyone could want to quit. Apart from the decent pay, this place was a dream come true in itself. When he went for the interview, he rather just wanted to be inside and didn't even expect to be accepted. He knew for sure that if he wasn't going to be fired, he wasn't going to leave. After some thought, he asked, "Can I ask you a question?" "Try," Dan said. "Why did you quit?" "Well, how can I put it? There are several reasons," Dan stretched out. Sven raised his eyebrows high in anticipation, looking at his colleague. Not wanting to ask clarifying questions, he waited for Dan to continue his thought. But Dan just remained silent. Apparently he didn't want to talk, but Sven was still curious. Without fear of sounding tactless, he asked, "So what are the reasons?" "It's not a good place. Not a good place," Dan muttered. "Why are you surprised?" "I'm not surprised. More like confused." "What do you mean?" "That's what I mean. It's a tough place to work. The staff is a snake's tangle." Sven got a little nervous. "How does it manifest itself?" "You'll find out for yourself," Dan said. "Tell me," Sven asked. Dan made a disgruntled face, but didn't have time to answer. One of the hotel guests, a young and very pretty girl, appeared, smiled at the doorman, and asked them where they could go nearby. Sven hurried to fulfill his work duty. He told her where to go and what to see. When she was out of sight, Sven repeated his question. "What's wrong with this place? Tell me. I've got work to do here." "There's nothing to tell," Dan said. "The people here are fake, and I don't mean the visitors, I mean the employees, you know." "Honestly, not so much. Gossip, intrigue, backstabbing. There's a lot going on here." You know, when you said it wasn't a good place, I was thinking of something else, Sven admitted. Dan laughed merrily. What did you expect to hear? That I'd tell you about the hotel being built in a graveyard? Sven sneered. Well, sort of. That's bollocks. I've heard all sorts of stories about it being a cursed place and blah, blah, blah. You know what the truth is? There's some really bad people working here. That's the secret. Sven made a neat point. But you've worked here too. I did. But as soon as I realized that the employees here were scheming, I quit. How long did you work here? Not long. You couldn't say Sven was scared, but he was definitely a bit tense. So you had an argument with someone? Yeah. Is that why you decided to quit? Well, you could say that. Who? Dan gave Sven a disgruntled look and turned away. Sven realized that his mentor was in no hurry to share his secrets and decided to leave him alone. They stood in silence for about 10 minutes, and at the end of that time, Sven couldn't stand it any longer. I take it you don't want to talk about the reasons for your conflicts, but to ask in a more generalized way, look, you're here to mentor me, aren't you? So, Dan muttered. Well, to mentor me, to give me advice. But more to the point, please tell me more about the local team. Is everyone here a real gossiping savage? It's a big group. Surely there are some normal people. Normal, he repeated, rubbing his hands together thoughtfully. Well, maybe there are, but what does it matter? There's no need to be afraid of them. Then tell me, who should be feared? Who should be avoided? Who should not be contacted at all? Dan squinted. Dania, a lot of people. Like one of the waitresses at the restaurant, she's a bitch. Her name's Zoe. She's the only one here with that name. Don't even look in her direction. And she's like, ugh, I can't even remember her. What is she capable of? But you don't want to know. Sven frowned. There were more questions and fewer answers. After a moment's thought, he asked, Is that all? No, I told you maybe it just didn't work out for me. You'll be fine. So you should avoid only the waitress. Avoid the security chief in the first place. He's a real SAR. Sven smiled. Thanks for the warning. You think I'm joking? I'm dead serious. Never make eye contact with him. And if possible, don't talk to him at all. Pretend you don't exist. Is it that serious? You have no idea how serious. I'm wrong about some things, but not this. Everyone's really scared of him. Sven's day at work was going well. His partner and mentor wasn't the most talkative person, but he was happy with him. Although Dan didn't say anything particularly interesting or important, Sven tried to listen to avoid Zoe and the security chief. The advice was interesting, but a little odd. Sven decided it was worth following, though he never quite understood why. The first day came to an end, followed by the second, third, and even the fifth. Slowly but surely Sven joined the local team, trying to seem like a nice and good-natured guy. And although it was too early to judge, Dan seemed more and more strange to Sven with each new day. Who did he have a fight with around here? Everyone who got in his way seemed to be very nice, pleasant people. Sven had almost finally come to the conclusion that the problem was Dan himself. But he still wondered why he had singled out two particular people. So Sven decided to find out more about it. Before the start of the shift, the newcomer accidentally met one of the representatives of the team, whom he had not seen before. It was a rather elderly woman who worked as a maid. Seeing her friendly look, Sven decided to have a little chat with her. Hello, I'm new here. My name is Sven. She smiled at him and introduced herself. Hello. You're the new doorman. It's good to have you here. That Dan, you know. My name is Samantha. Nice to meet you, Samantha. Sven frowned. What's wrong with Dan? Can't communicate with him? He's not much of a talker, but he doesn't seem to be a bad person. You don't know him very well, Samantha explained persuasively. He's a young guy, but he acts like a market girl. You mean he's a gossip? Haven't you noticed? I can't believe he hasn't told you any gossip. He really hasn't. Although, to be honest, I did ask him to tell me a few things. Samantha eyed the newcomer incredulously. And what? He didn't share anything with you at all? Sven wondered if he should tell her. What if it was a secret? He folded his arms across his chest, looking down at his feet. Secret or not, Dan wouldn't be here anytime soon. And Sven really wanted to know about the waitress and the head of security. Getting more air into his lungs, he told Samantha everything he'd heard. When she heard the doorman, the maid laughed. Dan's got it going on. Yes, Zoe is an angel. She's beautiful, clever, a polyglot. She knows 4 languages. Sven wondered. Why did he say that about her? He called her a bitch. Why? Because she'd put a spell on him. A spell. Well, it wasn't her. It was someone else who put a spell on her. And the other one, as it turned out, was protected. Sven raised his eyebrows as high as possible and couldn't help laughing. Samantha, you're joking. Would I joke about something like that? No, of course not. And I see you're one of those? What those? Well, what do you call yourselves, skeptics? You don't believe in hexing, do you? Well, it's not that I don't believe in it, Sven replied, trying not to offend her. It's more like I don't trust it. How did you realize it? How could I not? For a long time, Dan didn't notice her at all. Then he fell in love with her and chased her around like a dog. She even hid from him. That's why he quit. He couldn't handle the stress. The spell was strong. Can you imagine how bad he feels? Sven said with a nervous chuckle. To be honest, I don't. But I'll tell you, he feels very bad. That's why he's so glum. And who do you think did it? How the hell should I know? It's not a nice place. Sven smiled. Not a good place, you say? You know, Dan said the same thing. He wasn't lying about that. The place is creepy. Shall I tell you the history of this hotel? Sven took a quick glance at his watch and, realizing there was still time, nodded. Of course you will. Well then, listen. Back in the last century, this hotel was built by a very rich man. There were terrible rumors about him in the society. They said he was afraid of daylight. Nobody knew how he made his fortune. Nor did they know his biography. The hotel was built, opened, and then people started disappearing from it. Sven sighed heavily, but he kept his expression unchanged, trying to appear friendly. From the looks of it, it's Samantha who's not entirely rational, to say the least. She's one of those people who believes in ghosts and horoscopes, he thought. Sven decided to listen to the story, even though he realized it would be some kind of childish scare story, and asked, "Where did they disappear to?" One of the survivors told what had happened here. That rich man had built the hotel in such a way that there were many back doors behind its walls. He used the back doors to steal people and lock them in the basement. In fact, there's a whole underground city underneath the hotel. Really? Sven asked skeptically. Is there any confirmation other than rumors? Yes, of course. When the public found out, all the secret passages were concreted over. Some of them are still there, though. They're just hard to find. So the hotel is actually much bigger. The hidden part of the hotel is 2 or even 3 times bigger than the main part. But this, of course, no one alive today has seen. But it's the truth, Samantha replied deftly, looking around. I see. Why would the hotel owner want to steal people? She lowered her voice so that it was hard to make out what she was saying. The man who escaped saw a terrible thing. The owner was stealing people to drink their blood. He was a vampire. Sven couldn't hold back a nervous chuckle. Wow, he replied, although he really wanted to change the subject. He realized that Samantha was very peculiar, but to be so, Sven decided to change the subject. That's a very interesting story. So Dan lied about Zoe? Can we talk to her? You should. She's a very nice and interesting girl. What about the head of security? Dan said he's to be feared, avoided. He's dangerous to even make eye contact with. That's ridiculous. He's a security guard he's supposed to protect, not scare. Samantha got serious. He didn't lie to you here. It's true. Our head of security is best avoided. Sven wondered. What did he do? You don't want to know. Just always keep in mind that he's a dangerous man. Sven was so dumbfounded that he didn't know how to react. It seemed Dan and Samantha were completely different people. Their view of the hotel was radically different, and even the version about the waitress was dissimilar. Samantha had told him that the hotel was cursed, while Dan held a more earthy view. He believed it was the people who were the problem, and as different as they were, they agreed on one thing: the head of security, as silly as it sounded, was dangerous. Sven was beginning to worry in earnest, but his interest in the guard's persona had certainly grown, wondering what he had done wrong. Sven said a quick goodbye to Samantha and hurried to his workplace. Dan, as always, stood at the door with a disgruntled look. "Where have you been?" he asked. "I met a maid." "Which one?" Dan pushed himself off the wall and was now on his feet. "Samantha. You know, the older lady. And that psycho. Did she tell you the story about the vampire owner?" There was silence for a few seconds, and then they laughed at the same time, and Dan said, "Well, yes, the legend is certainly above board. What do you think of the underground city? That's my favorite part." "I like the vampire part better," Sven said with a laugh. "Yeah, I wonder if she's Samantha." "Nothing interesting. Just uneducated and a bit crazy." "What else did she say?" Sven couldn't resist sharing. "That you're wearing a spell." Dan smiled. "Ah, that. But she always finds some magical explanation." "So you had something with Zoe that made you dislike her so much?" "We didn't have a thing. She was just being a big shot." "Swan. Did you like her?" "Well, not that I liked her, but yeah, I wanted to court her and she rejected you." "Is that why you quit?" "No, it wasn't that. But she rejected you, yeah. I don't care about her. She thinks too highly of herself." "But it's clear." "What's clear to you?" "Why you're so angry with her." "It's not that." "Shit. Come on, I don't want to talk about it." With each new day, Sven got to know his team better and better. Dan and Zoe's story had finally been sorted out. It was true, Dan had his eye on a pretty waitress, and she'd rejected him, and in a rude way. It explained a lot of things, like why he disliked her and why Samantha, who loved mysticism and fairy tales, had found such a strange explanation for his crush. Sven was a sociable man and often chatted with one of his colleagues. Gossip was present, of course, and some were openly confrontational at all. Other than that, however, things weren't too bad, at least not as bad as Dan had described it. Ordinary people, just like everywhere else. But one question in particular began to plague Sven: what's wrong with the head of security? And even though he never got to meet him, he decided to find out anyway. He didn't know how. The probationary period came to an end and Sven was officially hired. By this point, Dan had finally allowed himself to leave the workplace, which made Sven upset. Although they wouldn't have been friends in normal life, he was a little more fun to be with at work. Sven decided he needed a new friend. During lunch, Sven met another new face. He turned out to be one of the receptionists. Deciding that this was a perfect match for friendship, Sven cheekily sat down next to him. "Hi, my name's Sven. I'm the new doorman." "We've met," he replied blankly. "My name is Tom. I don't really remember." "Of course you don't. You've got so many people passing through you. How can you remember any one person here? Mind if I join you for lunch?" "Well, you've already sat down." Sven laughed to smooth things over a bit and hurried off to make conversation. "It's a good day today. Personally, I've only come across very nice people." "Yes, that's rare in our line of work," Tom replied. "How are you doing?" Tom threw his fork on the table rather rudely. "Sven, can I ask you a question?" "Sure." How do you never get tired? All you do all day is talk to people. Don't you want to be quiet at least at lunchtime? Well, no, Sven admitted. Why? I see. Are you the chatty type? He shrugged. Well, I guess. Tom tapped his fingers on the table. I'm not. Sven nodded, as if to let him know he wasn't offended. Tom, okay. I won't bother you. Thank you. Sven started to eat, but a little while later he spoke up again. Listen. Tom was really pissed off. What else? I like Dan better. Sven smiled guiltily. You two are so much alike. You're both so quiet. What did you want to ask? I've heard a rumor that our head of security is a bit strange. Tom looked round fearfully and spoke in a low voice. He's not weird, he's scary, really scary. You haven't seen him if you're asking questions like that. By the way, no, I haven't seen him yet. Is it true that you should avoid him? Yes, 100%. Sven smiled. Is it true there are vampires around here? You've been talking to Mrs. Samantha, haven't you? Yeah. Right. Well, I'm not telling you anything about vampires. Why not? Don't you believe Samantha's legend? It's not her legend. Samantha didn't invent it. There's a lot of talk about it. Well, do you believe it? Not that I believe it. I don't know. I'm a person who doesn't take anything on faith in advance, Sven replied. Interesting. So what about the head of security? Nothing. Just avoid him. He's a dangerous man. Damn it. But why does everyone talk about it, but no one can explain it? Tom smiled weakly. You'll understand once you see him. Hell yeah. Who the hell is he? Just a little more, and I'll think he's the creator of the Vampire Hotel. Well, look. Imagine a big 2-meter tall man with broad shoulders, bald and very strong ex-military, pumped up, perpetually disgruntled, with a giant scar all over his face. Tom drew the image. Sven clapped his hands unconsciously. Yep. Well, that's what he looks like. Now, add to that image the knowledge that he's a man of hard luck, bitter at everyone and everything. So would you sit down to lunch with him? Sven scratched the back of his head. I don't feel like it. Well, there's a reason you're so scared of him. He's really something to be afraid of. Interesting, Sven said. I don't know, I don't think so. Tom shrugged his shoulders. Now we can eat in silence. The intrigue of the security chief's identity was growing like a snowball. Sven had no doubt now that he was to be feared. He was going to avoid him, but he could not forget him. What kind of a fate had he suffered? Sven decided to talk to someone who might know the life story of this mysterious man. From one of the floor clerks on duty, he inquired, "Who has worked here the longest?" And in response, he heard a name. Miss Caroline, the head of administration. He could only hope that she would be more talkative. Just in case, he asked the desk clerk, "What do you think of the head of security?" To which he received an exhaustive answer. "He's like a shark. It's better not to mess with him. And if you do, it's best not to piss him off." Sven was able to see Miss Caroline 3 days later after he'd spoken to the duty officer. The evening shift was coming to an end, and Sven found her in one of the workrooms. From afar, she seemed a good candidate for conversation. Wide smile, straight posture, neatly styled hair. Maybe it was the cost of the profession, one must always exude friendliness. But it was as if Sven had sensed that she would be a good person to talk to. And he was right. "Hello, I'm new here." "A doorman?" she asked. "Yes, hi. Nice to meet you." "My name is Caroline," she replied. "Nice to meet you. Are you busy?" "No," she said in a friendly tone. Sven almost shrieked with joy and sat down next to her. "How are you?" I'm fine, thank you. And yours? By the way, how do you like it here? Well, you know, it's pretty much as I imagined it would be. It's all kind of mystical, isn't it? Whoever I talk to, I get all sorts of information. Some say that the people working here are evil, to put it mildly, and some tell stories that make your blood run cold, and some are just strange. I haven't had a chance to get to the bottom of it yet. But overall, how do you like it here? Overall, I guess, yeah, but these vampire stories. Mrs. Caroline laughed. I think I know who you've been talking to. Do you believe in all that? Of course I don't. It's all nonsense. Thank God. Sven was relieved. There are a lot of people who do believe in it, as it turns out. Well, they're just bored. But, you know, Sven, it's better that way than that way, right? Yeah, I suppose you're right. Can I ask you a question? Sure. Is it true you've worked here longer than anyone else? Well, you could say that. I'm one of the old-timers. Oh, that's great. Tell me, can I ask you about someone in particular? Not vampires, I hope. Caroline smiled. No, the head of security. Who is he? Mrs. Caroline's face changed. Ugh. That's a very complicated man. Sven shook his head. God, he exclaimed. Why is that? Why does everyone talk about him like that? Well, because that's the way he is, she said and smiled weakly. Don't mess with him. And stop asking about him. It'll get to him sooner or later. And anyway, forget it. Who the hell is he, this head of security? Sven asked nonchalantly. Can you at least tell me his name and what his fate is? His name is Michael, but you should address him as Mr. Michael. Although, of course, it's best not to talk to him. Why not? Do you know anything about his hard fate? Mrs. Caroline looked round. I know. Tell me, can you keep a secret? Of course I can, Sven replied excitedly. If I don't find out what's wrong with him, I'll go crazy. All I know is that Mr. Michael is unsociable. Most of our team is afraid of him and treats him, shall we say, not in the best way. A lot of people know about his plight, but nobody knows what exactly happened to him. Everyone thinks he's just venting negativity on everyone because of what happened to him. That's basically what it is. But you do know something specific about him, don't you? Yes, I do. Michael and I knew each other in the past. We were both employed at this hotel by the same man, a mutual friend. So this Mr. Michael is one of the old guys like you? Sven asked. Yes. As I said, Mr. Michael is quiet, but he treats me better than the others, so he told me a little about himself. Sven snickered. Apparently it's a mystery behind 7 seals. Actually it is, but I can see you're so interested in him. I'll tell you Mr. Michael's story in return for you promising not to tell anyone, and at least try not to judge him. Thank you, I won't tell anyone, I promise. All right then. In general, Mr. Michael, former officer of special services, held in the Department of Own Security, not the last position, received good money, was married to a good girl who gave birth to his son. Everything was great, so much so that Mr. Michael relaxed. And one day at one of the corporate parties, he fell madly in love with another girl, let's say, with low social responsibility. I don't know what it was about her, but Mr. Michael literally lost his head. Samantha would say he was bewitched. But we know that's not true. She must have been a skilled manipulator, maybe some kind of hypnotist. I don't know. He started courting her immediately, and in the end he was ready to do anything for her, even to leave his family with a child. His wife understood but pretended not to notice, and for nothing. After all, in the end, that second girl set him a condition to kick out his wife or she will leave him. And Mr. Michael was so in love that without a second thought agreed to this terrible act. At that moment, he did not know that his wife was already pregnant with their second child, and when he found out, he convinced her to have an abortion. He left his wife with a child in her arms alone in a strange city, because she was a visitor. He brought his mistress into the house and married her, and forgot about his former family. What happened to his wife is a mystery. Mr. Michael doesn't know, and neither do we. But it was probably because of this act that Mr. Michael's life was in trouble. After a couple of years, he got bored with his beauty, and she started cheating on him left and right, and he put up with it. He was in love. It got to the point where she was having an affair with his boss. Can you imagine the kind of person she is? She turned Mr. Michael's boss's head, and eventually he was scandalously sacked. But Mr. Michael never gave up hope. He tried to get a job somewhere else, spinning like a squirrel in a wheel, afraid of losing his beloved. And that fear didn't endear him to his ex-wife's new boyfriend. He was beaten to a pulp, and that girl left him. He was in intensive care, and when he woke up, he realized he'd lost everything. He had lost his flat, all his money, and of course his beloved. And so he was left with nothing, no job, no home, and no prospects. An old friend of Mr. Michael's, a mutual acquaintance of ours, took pity on him and helped him get a job here as head of security. Whatever Mr. Michael's personal life, he's a good worker. And now he lives on the outskirts of New York, in a tiny flat, works here, and that's it. It's not an easy fate, but it seems worthy of its owner. Sven opened his eyes wide. Wow. I was expecting something else. Well, how is it? Miss Caroline remarked. Of course he's offended at the world after that. Sven tilted his head to the side. Well, I suppose. But it's his own fault, really, isn't he? Yes, I suppose, so agreed Mrs. Caroline. But I think he's paid the price too harshly. Where's his wife? You know, the first one who gave him the baby. Mrs. Caroline shrugged her shoulders. I don't know, and nobody knows. Well, have I satisfied your interest? She asked. Sven decided to think for a moment before answering. Although he expected something different, he felt he was glad to know the answer to his question. It wasn't really the head of security that interested Sven. In fact, it wasn't just him. He wanted so much to know the secrets of this place, why everyone talked about it, what the wide doors of the hotel hid. It was only after all this time that he realized it held no secrets. It's all people's fault. Every man has his own special destiny. Yes, thank you for telling me, said Sven. I won't tell anyone. That's good, Mrs. Caroline said. She looked over Sven's shoulder and her eyes widened. Wow, we were just talking about him. There he is. Where? Mr. Michael walked into the staff room. The door swung wide open, and the thud of the door hitting the wall made everyone in the room wince. All eyes were fixed on Mr. Michael, but he didn't care about that. He swept everyone present with his crowning glare and found his target the head of administration named Mrs. Caroline. With a confident stride, Mr. Michael made his way towards her, ignoring everyone else. He was so sick of everyone looking at him like he was some kind of superstar, and when Mr. Michael gave them his crooked stare, they shamefully hid their eyes. Idiots, he thought. They'd be better off with themselves than with this silly gossip. Mr. Michael didn't know if that mystical first hotelier existed, but with each new day he realized that he was getting more and more fed up with these tales. If it were up to him, he would send these fools down to the basement. As he approached Mrs. Caroline, he noticed only now that she was not alone. Opposite her sat some kid, afraid to lift his head. His softness and fearfulness made Mr. Michael angry. Who's that? He asked the receptionist. This is our new doorman. Name's Sven, she replied. Mr. Michael glared at the boy, expecting him to at least look back at him. But the puny boy was staring at his feet and shaking. Hey, doorman, get out of here. Grown-ups need to talk, Mr. Michael said gruffly. Sven rose slowly to his feet. Sure, I'm sorry, he mumbled and ran away. Mr. Michael flopped down in his seat, though the chair was a little small for him, to say the least. Mrs. Caroline sighed heavily. Why did you scare Sven? He doesn't seem a bad boy. Just to let him know, said Mr. Michael dryly. That's why everybody's afraid of you. Do you know they really do scare the newbies with you? And thank them very much for that. Mr. Michael replied loudly. At least some good came from the gossip and I stopped being harassed by those freaks. Were you looking for me? Mrs. Caroline asked, shaking her head. Yes, replied Mr. Michael. Is something wrong? Yes, something important is going to happen at our hotel very soon. Yes, what is it? Mr. Michael lowered his voice. There's going to be a wedding. Oh, good. Is it a secret? Why are you whispering? No, but I don't want our staff to get overexcited. Michael, I don't understand you. Well, a wedding is a wedding. It feels like a first time. It's about the groom. It's our mayor. What? It's Mrs. Caroline couldn't finish the word because Mr. Michael had his hand over her mouth. Shut up, will you? Yes, the mayor of our town. She pushed the rude man away and said, I'm just shocked. That's why it's best to keep a low profile. We're preparing little by little and keeping the team calm. Who's the bride? Mr. Michael shrugged. Nobody knows. That's the real mystery right there. I've been looking on the internet, and from what I gather, she's carefully hiding her identity. I wonder why she would do that. Why not reveal herself right away? Everyone will find out who she is sooner or later anyway. Mr. Michael frowned. Don't you realize? It's the bloody mayor. Do you have any idea how much power he has and how much money? People like that are protective of their personal lives, and for good reason. It's usually the people closest to them that they manipulate. You mean he's hiding his fiancée because he's afraid for her? Yeah, I guess he is. Okay, well, I get it. Let's get ready and keep it quiet about whose wedding it's going to be. By the way, what are you worried about? Nobody's talking to you anyway. That's not what I'm worried about. It's days like this when you have to be on your guard. Politics is like a red rag to a bull for terrorists. Oh, now I'm nervous. Chuckles, yeah. Well, anyway, get ready, Mr. Michael said and stood up abruptly. He left the room as quickly as he had entered it. He slammed the door against the wall, and at the end of it, he gave everyone a disgruntled look at how much he hated them all. But of course, he hated himself first and foremost. Mr. Michael had lost everything, and more importantly, how so stupid and so ridiculous to lose everything because of some girl. Mr. Michael was well aware that he had ruined more than one life. He walked towards his office, noticing perfectly well how they were afraid of him. They hid their eyes, turned away, pretended not to notice him. What morons they all are, he thought. Mr. Michael had always dreamed of going somewhere in the middle of nowhere. Already on his way to his workplace, a beautiful long-haired girl, so familiar, swept past him. His heart raced and he called out to her. Jane, Jane, stop. But the girl went on ahead. Mr. Michael flushed with emotion and followed her with a firm step. He grabbed her roughly by the shoulder, forcing her to turn round. Jane, you've got me confused with someone else. Keep your hands to yourself, she said. Mr. Michael jerked as if slapped and took a step back. It wasn't Jane. It was the one that had crossed his mind most often in recent years. Jane was the name of his first wife, sweet and gentle and so kind. It was only after losing everything that Mr. Michael realized how wrong he'd been. But nothing could be changed. He remembered her only after he was left with nothing, dreaming of her beauty, kindness, and obedience. He remembered what a wonderful cook she was, what a marvelous hostess she was, and no matter how hard Mr. Michael tried, he could never find her. He thought of Jane every day, went to sleep, and woke up thinking of her. He could always see her in the crowd, dream about her. And though Mr. Michael knew that she would never forgive him, he longed to look at her once more. He had his own son, his only son. And Mr. Michael had traded him in for some cheap girl. Looking at the girl who looked so much like Jane, he felt his heart constrict. This isn't her, Mr. Michael thought. He walked into the office, sat down and thought, why did I ever think I could recognize her? After all these years, she must have changed a lot. Maybe her hair wasn't as long. Maybe she'd changed the way she dressed, learned to wear heels. Mr. Michael grimaced. How many times can I bring her up? It was like there was nothing else to think about. He tried to put her out of his mind and even succeeded. But the intrusive thoughts were replaced by the memory of his son. He must be over 20 now. Mr. Michael shook his head. We need to focus on the wedding. He called his boss to discuss future events. A few days later, everyone knew about the wedding. The staff was almost torn as they discussed the future guests, some wondering who the bride would be. Some wanted at least a glimpse of the mayor, but Mr. Michael didn't give a damn. He made his way through the crowd of colleagues, not forgetting to push with his rock-hard shoulders. "What are you all piled up here for?" he asked in a voice that sounded like thunder. The colleagues fell silent. Mr. Michael glared at them contemptuously, waiting for some daredevil to take the lead. "What are you standing there for? Get out," Mr. Michael growled. The maids, waitresses, doormen, and many others parted. Clenching his fists, he headed down the path set aside for him. Suddenly, he heard an unfamiliar voice. "The representative of the wedding customers is arriving once again today. We're interested in seeing him." Mr. Michael became furious. "Who said that?" he asked, turning round sharply. The doorman took an uncertain step forward. "It's me. My name is Sven. You better stay out of my way," Mr. Michael growled. "Well, you asked," Mr. Michael said the doorman. "I don't care. You're just standing here like idiots to see some representative. You're just sick." But there was a woman's voice. "The rep is so cute." "Zoe, shut up," Mr. Michael whispered. He did not continue the conversation and quickly left the corridor where the crowd had formed. He heard shouts of admiration for the representative. "He's so handsome, young, and rich. I hope he'll look at me," and so on. The door slammed shut, cutting Mr. Michael off from this annoying muttering. "I think the female half of the staff have gone mad," he thought. Mr. Michael was angry, though he didn't understand why the workday was going on as usual. He was minding his own business when suddenly he accidentally bumped into someone he had never seen before. He was a tall young man. Not expecting to be hit by a big man like himself, the stranger jumped aside. "Hey man, watch it," he exclaimed. Of course, Mr. Michael had not expected such impertinence. He slowly turned round and gave a wolfish stare. "Say that again." "Look where you're going," said the young man, rubbing his bruised shoulder. "Who are you?" Mr. Michael asked him firmly. "Who are you? Why are you acting like this? What are you, the center of the earth?" Mr. Michael closed his eyes, counting to 5, 1, 2, 3. A long time ago, a psychiatrist he knew had taught him how to calm down so he wouldn't make a scene. 4. Mr. Michael opened his eyes sharply. "Shut your mouth, puppy, before I smash you against the wall," he growled. "Uncle, you're out of your mind. Maybe I should get you some pills." "Hey," joked the stranger. Mr. Michael couldn't stand it and pinned the insolent man against the wall, using only one arm. The young man hung in the air, beginning to suffocate. "Let go." "Who are you?" "Just another night doorman. Didn't they teach you to speak to those above your rank?" he hissed. "I represent the interests of the wedding," he said in a low voice. Mr. Michael released his hand, and his companion fell to the floor, breathing heavily. "What are you doing?" he asked, panting. "Don't forget who you're talking to." Mr. Michael spat out the words and started to leave. But he didn't. From somewhere in the distance came the familiar disgruntled voice of the supervisor. "What's going on here?" The representative, barely breathing, pointed his finger in the direction of Mr. Michael. "That man, he's rabid. He almost strangled me," said the victim. The boss flew over to him, helped him up, and apologized. "I'm sorry, for God's sake. I'm sorry. It's our security guard." "Are you kidding me? He's the one you should be guarding everyone from." "I'm sorry, we'll fire him. I'll find someone who can help you." The hotel manager made a quick call, and in a couple of minutes a pretty girl appeared in the corridor where the altercation had taken place. She took the injured man under the elbow and led him away in an unknown direction. Mr. Michael and his boss were left alone. "What is this?" asked the disgruntled boss. "What?" mumbled Mr. Michael. What the hell is this? So everyone's afraid of you, Michael. You, and you're our head of security, by the way. You've intimidated the staff, fine, but you're already lashing out at the guests, and that's out of line. Mr. Michael mumbled something to himself. I want you to act like a human being, the boss continued. Mr. Michael rolled his eyes. I'm acting normal. This guy asked for it. You ask for everything. Do I have to fire you or what? Mr. Michael chuckled. Well, if you promise that ghoul, then go ahead. The manager hesitated. Shit, you know I wouldn't go for that, don't you? Yeah, I suspect not. Of course you're valuable. Where else would I find someone like you? He scratched his chin. This conversation is over. I've got to go, but promise me that was the last time, the boss said. Mr. Michael promised nothing. He knew himself well. He couldn't help himself when he was being rude. With his usual firm step, he went back to the office and tried to forget about it. After all, such an important event for the whole hotel was right around the corner. The day of the wedding had arrived. The hotel literally stood on its ears. From the very early morning began to arrive such guests, at the sight of which even the most steadfast workers lost their grip. Singers, actors, comedians, politicians, artists. It seemed that the best of the best had been invited to this celebration. Waitresses turned up their noses in the hope that some celebrity would pay attention to them. The cooks were going crazy at the cooker, realizing the risk of making a mistake. The maids ran around, peering with interest into the faces of the guests. Even the guards, Mr. Michael's subordinates, were staring at the visitors. Everyone was delighted. Everyone except Mr. Michael. To him, all this pomp seemed too gaudy and overly flamboyant. As much as Mr. Michael would have liked to leave, he wanted the day to come to an end, but he had to work, and work well. From a security point of view, this day could have brought a lot of trouble. The guests were very important people, and Mr. Michael knew better than anyone else that such people had to be guarded with the utmost care. For ordinary visitors, rich though they were unlikely to be of much interest to anyone. Politicians, on the other hand, should always be in the public eye. Mr. Michael watched the faces of those who came in while his guards were examining suspicious items. He was busy assessing the overall situation. In this kind of confusion, someone dangerous could sneak in. No matter how Mr. Michael felt about his colleagues and his guests, he still knew for sure that anything, even his own life, would be sacrificed for the safety of those around him. Staring at the camera monitor, Mr. Michael's heart thudded. He thought he saw a familiar face. No, it wasn't Jane, but someone connected to her. The girl skipped past those annoying guards and the new doorman, scrutinizing the interior. No wonder, as far as Mr. Michael remembered, that lady lived rather poorly. Then what was she doing here? Mr. Michael strained to remember her name. Isabella, perhaps? No, he would never remember whether it was Isabella or not. It didn't matter at all, for it was not the name that interested Mr. Michael. This girl he saw was Jane's best friend. They were in the same class. He'd only seen her a few times in his life, at a wedding and his wife's birthday party. What are the chances that Mr. Michael wasn't mistaken? And if he wasn't wrong, what was she doing here? After a little thought, Mr. Michael jumped up from his seat, and a couple of minutes later was standing in front of the doorman, looking down at him. What's your name? Sven? Mr. Michael asked irritably. Sven, the man replied. How's it going? What? None of your business, Mr. Michael retorted. All right, and I've got. Shut up. Sven obediently shut up. Mr. Michael counted to himself and then raised his voice again. A girl with a short haircut and white hair just walked by. Got it, Mr. Michael. To be honest, I don't have such a good memory. Well, put it to the test. Sven thought for a moment. Well, it's a bit simple, isn't it? I wondered what she was doing here. Yes, agreed Mr. Michael. What did she say? What did she ask? Oh, nothing much. She asked where the toilet was. Mr. Michael pressed his lips together. Shit, he frowned. Sven asked, embarrassed. Why, do you know her? Why do you care? Mr. Michael cut him off. He was silent for a moment, and then he said, "You know, I think you should let it go." What? What are you talking about? Mr. Michael didn't understand. Mr. Michael was ready to explode. Did this guy really know something? He was already clenching his fists before he could count to 3. But the work radio made such a sound that Mr. Michael knew it was no good. He rushed towards the guard post, knocking down everyone in his way. This sound is used only in extreme cases. He arrived on the scene and immediately asked, "What's wrong?" "Mr. Michael, there's trouble. Unknown persons called with the message that there is a bomb in the restaurant hall." "Oh shit," he cursed. "Did you get the number?" "Begin evacuation," a voice said. "Calm down," Mr. Michael interrupted. "First, we have to make sure that the information is not false. That is, while we're sitting tight, you be vigilant. This message could be a distraction." They gave the coordinates of the bomb, where it is, someone said. "Yes, but they could have lied," Mr. Michael replied. "Good. Wait for instructions. I'll check it carefully. I don't want to cause a panic. Call the bomb squad." Mr. Michael rolled his eyes as he put on his pre-prepared waistcoat. "Stay in touch. I'm on my way." He tried his best to keep a straight face as he stepped inside the banquet hall. The wedding was in full swing. The music, the noise. All the politicians and celebrities were dancing, singing, shouting toasts. Mr. Michael grimaced. They're rich, but they're acting like savages, trying not to arouse suspicion or cause unnecessary panic. He went to the coordinates he had sent to check for a bomb. In general, Mr. Michael was calm. Having vast experience in law enforcement agencies, he knew very well as a rule, information about a bomb is false. With a keen eye on all the places where it could theoretically be, Mr. Michael breathed a sigh of relief. "They lied," as always, he said into the radio. Mr. Michael checked everything thoroughly several times and said there was no bomb. He was about to leave when he noticed a familiar face. The same friend of Jane's he had seen on the cameras was standing next to the bride, gesticulating vigorously and obviously telling her something. He frowned, heading in her direction. Why? He hadn't decided yet. He walked towards her with a firm step, when suddenly that lady flew off in an unknown direction, leaving his fiancée alone. Mr. Michael paused, wondering if he should approach the bride. Probably some pompous girl, and she wouldn't want to talk to him. He stared at the bride's back, then looked closer at the groom. The mayor was sitting at the table, talking to someone. Mr. Michael stood back, watching them, while the bride danced alone. For some unknown reason, but he looked her over with an appraising eye. There was something vaguely familiar in her movements. Suddenly she turned round to face him, and Mr. Michael was stunned. It was Jane himself. Mr. Michael had imagined this moment so often that he had forgotten how to breathe, and earlier he'd thought he couldn't recognize her. No, he would recognize her out of 1,000. His heart was pounding, and Mr. Michael, on the other hand, froze, not knowing what to do. Was his ex-wife the same one he had left with nothing alone, marrying the mayor? How could that be possible? Jane danced until she was tired. She stepped aside, and Mr. Michael knew it was time to act. It seems that the bomb information was nothing more than a joke by some idiots. So he could afford to relax, even just a little. On woozy legs, he walked over to her, not knowing what to say. She had changed so much. Her hair was shorter, her lips chubbier than before. And apparently she'd learned to walk in heels after all. "Jane," he whispered in a shaky voice. If anyone saw him now, they certainly wouldn't recognize Mr. Michael. Jane frowned and gave him a brief glance. "Do we know each other? Who are you?" He took a step forward. "Yes." She looked him over from head to toe. "Are you the security guard? Is something wrong?" "No, it's me, Michael." "Michael who?" Jane asked, perplexed. Mr. Michael's face changed. "Oh, it's you?" she exclaimed. "I am," he replied, averting his gaze. His conscience had been awake for some time, but now it came to him once more. The shame consumed Mr. Michael, and he said, faintly but still quietly, "I'm sorry." she snorted. I don't want to. Tears glistened in the eyes of the huge, bald, scarred Mr. Michael. I understand, but at least you'll think about it sometime, she replied dryly. Maybe she replied dryly. What are you doing here? Working. And I take it you're getting married? I already am, Jane smirked. Where's your sweetheart? I have no idea. You don't? I could hear the sarcasm in her words. Where's our son? Our son? You mean my son? He won't even remember you, and you're nothing to him. Mr. Michael was prepared to take any insult from her just to be near her. He decided to change the subject. Jane, how did you do it? What? Get married? She laughed. Did you think you were going to make me cry for the rest of my life? No, I was just wondering how you managed it all. I worked. Steadfast, she replied. Long and hard. My friends gave me money, I rented a flat, got 2 jobs. I was a salesman by night and a travel agent by day. That's where I met my future husband, by the way. The mayor came to you to pick out a tour? Yes, that's right. Is there anything else you wanted? I have to get back to my guests. Many questions were on his tongue, but Mr. Michael decided to ask something distant. Ah, that's what that white rat was doing here. What's her name, Isabella? Emma is my best friend, and don't you dare call her that. Jane flared up. I'm sorry, I saw her on the cameras and I was surprised. I wondered what she was doing here. I thought she couldn't afford a place like this. And she's a bridesmaid. Interesting? That's right. Emma flew in from our hometown for my wedding, and I'll be grateful to her for the rest of my life, because she was the one who saved me, gave me money, supported me, worried. That's how some women turn out to be much more courageous than men. That's right, Mr. Michael said. I hope she's doing well. And you too. Yeah, I'll go, Jane said. I don't even know why I'm talking to you after everything you've done. I just wanted to apologize for everything. Jane put her head down, but suddenly a rather rough voice made her turn round. Mum, get away from him, shouted a young man familiar to Mr. Michael. He's a psychopath, and he nearly strangled me. Mr. Michael realized, in the one who had called Jane Mum, he recognized the representative of the wedding planner he had clashed with recently in the corridor. He folded his arms across his chest and looked defiant. At the same time, Jane asked in surprise, John, what are you doing? Mr. Michael's jaw almost dropped. After Jane had called him by his first name, the simple truth came to him. He'd almost strangled his own son in the corridor. He wanted to fall to the ground in shame. At the same time, John approached Mr. Michael and looked him contemptuously in the eye. What the hell are you doing here? You should have been sacked. Mr. Michael didn't break eye contact, but he wasn't in the mood for an argument. He put his hand on John's shoulder under the surprised looks and squeezed it. Son. John laughed, brushing his hand off. Man, what are you? He looked at Jane. Mum, John sighed heavily. Is it true? Look at it. There he is, your father, she said mockingly. The same one who left us, who threw his pregnant wife and baby out on the street. Is that how you imagined him? There he is. John wrinkled his nose. Yes, I'd be glad not to know him. Mr. Michael blushed, turned pale. Even he had literally no words to try to defend his honor in just a few minutes. His conscience, however, would not even allow him to open his mouth in their direction. He lowered his head, deciding that he was worthy of any insults. But there were none, for at the same second there was a loud, chilling clap. Mr. Michael knew that sound well. While the artists and politicians, who knew only the good life, turned their heads, he got down to business. The minutes counted. Grabbing his ex-wife and son under his arms, he began to lead them, covering them, towards an emergency secret exit. Jane stopped understanding anything and blindly followed her ex-husband, and John tried to break free. What's going on? But his mother quickly made him realize that this was no time for jokes. Follow your father now. All this lasted only a couple of seconds, but Mr. Michael quickly realized what was going on. Long before the main villains appeared, armed terrorists burst into the banquet hall. The guests screamed in terror. Someone fainted. Most of them rushed to the exit, but the way was blocked. A terrorist, probably the ringleader, fired a machine gun into the ceiling. It down on the ground. But they didn't yet know who they were messing with. There was someone in the banquet hall who was out of their league. Mr. Michael knew at once what had happened. The terrorists had called in false information to distract the guards from the main action. Once they got rid of the guards, they planned to take hostages. And they would have definitely succeeded if it weren't for one thing. Mr. Michael stopped by the banquet hall to apologize. He immediately realized that the terrorists' target was not the entire hall, but just a few people, the mayor. The target was clear as day. The mayor and, of course, the people closest to him, i.e., his wife and stepson. Realizing all this, Mr. Michael acted as quickly as he could. He quickly muttered into his radio, informing his subordinates of the incident and dragging Jane and John behind him, sending them out through the service exit, ordering them to run as fast as possible, and of course to call for backup. But there was no way he could leave on his own. He suspected that the terrorists had come solely for the mayor, that is, his ex-wife's new husband, and no matter how he felt about him, he couldn't do otherwise. He returned to the banquet hall quietly, almost imperceptibly. He noticed that the mayor was being closely followed by one of the terrorists. He devised a plan. He burst in unexpectedly, took a few bullets, but luckily he was wearing a bulletproof vest. He grabbed the mayor and quickly, even lightning fast, brought him to the service exit. "Save yourselves," he shouted, forcibly pushing the hostage, "and take care of my wife." Scared half to death, the mayor obeyed and ran down the back stairs to call for help, and Mr. Michael was obliged to return to help the other hostages. But before he could even turn around, he was shot in the neck, falling backwards. Mr. Michael lost track of time. He had basically lost time, place, and the essence of life, and he seemed to be submerged in a deep vat of water. He'd come out of it, and then he'd sink deeper. The first time he opened his eyes, he saw the panic of the medics. Then he saw an illuminated tunnel, and then he saw them. Mr. Michael opened his eyes, barely breathing. Jane and John were leaning over him. The son held his crying mother close to him and was the first to notice that Mr. Michael was awake. "Daddy," he shouted like a boy. "Son." Mr. Michael called out to him with great difficulty. "You forgive me, Dad, live. Dad, I forgive you. Just live." Jane turned to Mr. Michael and gently, so as not to hurt him, pressed him against her. "We forgive you. You saved us. You saved my husband. I'm having trouble breathing. Am I in the hospital?" "Yes, you've lost a lot of blood, but there's a chance," John answered. "There isn't," Mr. Michael said, losing his strength. "Promise me that ... that. We'll do anything." Jane shouted. "Take care of my dog. She's at home, a Labrador, my golden." Of course, Father John couldn't hold back his tears. "I'm proud of you." "Goodbye," Mr. Michael said quietly, and after these words his life was cut short. He died a true hero. Thanks to him, it was possible not only to save many lives, but also to neutralize the terrorists. All those who knew him spoke of him with respect, and although he had once done bad things, he managed to redeem himself. A plaque with his name and surname was hung right in the hotel, dubbing Mr. Michael a hero posthumously. The entire hotel staff attended the funeral, unable to hold back tears. Though most had not got to know him properly during his lifetime, he was missed. Once again, rumors spread around the hotel. This time, however, they were true. No one brought up vampires, maniacs, or even fictional blood rituals. Everyone was discussing the hero. Maybe the stories about him would be told very differently in the distant future. But for now, everyone knew that Mr. Michael was a hero. Mr. Michael's own son had taken custody of the loyal dog. Luckily, John loved dogs. For years, he dreamed of having one of his own, but had been hesitant to buy one. Heaven probably heard him, albeit in such a subtle way. John took the dog for himself and now remembered his father every day. Many people were surprised to learn that in the evenings, frowning Mr. Michael walked a good-natured golden Labrador. The dog was very kind. You could tell he'd been raised by a good man. Jane lived happily as the mayor's wife. Like Mr. Michael's eldest son, she remembered him, but not often, but now only with a kind word. After a year of married life, Jane became pregnant and gave birth to a second son. Her husband had suggested naming him after the man who had saved their lives. Heavy rain pounded on the umbrellas. Despite the mud underfoot, Sven stood still. No one traveled to the cemetery at this hour, but Sven didn't care. He was looking at the grave of Mr. Michael, a man he had never really known. Yet he felt such pride simply for the fact that they had been fortunate enough to know each other. He stared at the gravestone, pondering. He loved coming here to think. It seemed Mr. Michael could hear him, could talk to him. And though Sven realized it was strange, he didn't care. He looked round and said faintly, "Mr. Michael, I should propose to Zoe." "I'm afraid she'll say no," he said. A bright bolt of lightning struck somewhere in the distance, illuminating the dark graveyard for a split second, and Sven smiled broadly, taking it as a sign from Mr. Mike. "Thank you, Mr. Michael," he said. "I'm on my way to buy the ring now." Emily was raised by her father Joseph. She did not remember her mother and did not know what happened to her. Her father didn't like to talk about it and always left her in different ways. As time went on, Emily grew older. Here, just to get away from questions about her mother was no longer possible. On one of the next days, the 16-year-old girl rolled the most real scandal. "Why don't you tell me what happened to Mom? Is she alive or not? Why do you avoid this topic every time? How many times can you do this?" Emily paced from side to side, trying to calm herself down, but it was having no effect. Her father looked at her sympathetically, realizing that keeping quiet on the subject had become too hot in their small family. "Why are you silent again? Where's my mother? Why didn't you ever tell me where she is? Maybe I want to visit her. I want to tell her what's going on in my life, even if she never hears me." Emily had long ago concluded that something had happened to her mom, and that was why her father was keeping her tragic fate quiet. Perhaps it really would have been better that way. However, there was not a shred of truth in the girl's speculation. Sighing heavily, Joseph walked over to his daughter and put his hand on her shoulder. He looked carefully into the girl's eyes, trying to calm her resentment a little. But it was to no avail. "Who the hell are you to withhold information about my mother? And the one that carried me under her heart, that gave me this life. You have no right to withhold that information from me. Who is she? Where is she? Tell me something about her." Emily screamed with helplessness, with the pain and resentment that had been lurking in her soul for so long. Tears streamed down her cheeks, which she stubbornly ignored. Joseph's heart clenched unpleasantly as the picture unfolded, and he exhaled convulsively. And gathering all his will into a fist, he muttered, "Your mother just didn't want you. We found out late enough in the pregnancy that there was nothing we could do. She didn't want to have you, didn't want to become a mother, thought she was too young for it, and convinced me too that you didn't fit into our future. But even before you were born, I felt that you needed me, that you were the ray of hope for a bright future that I was not ready to give up. She could never love you, and right after you were born, she wrote a rejection letter. I begged her to think about it. I begged her to stay and be with you for a while. I assured her that she would love you, but your mother was adamant. She didn't want to spend time raising a child. She didn't want to wake up at night. She didn't want to change diapers. She didn't want to lose her beauty through constant sleep deprivation and stress. And she walked away, leaving you so tiny and defenseless alone in the hospital." His voice shook, and he stopped, deciding it wasn't worth continuing the story any further. Emily stared at her father in silence, trying to comprehend what she had just heard and make sense of her feelings. The only thing in Emily's girl's eyes was the question why. But that's not what she asked her father. "And you didn't even try to find her, didn't try to show her what I've become independent and not requiring so much attention and care. Maybe she could have loved me, wanted to come back and start a family. Why didn't you try to make sure I had a mom like any other normal kid? Emily switched to shouting again, not holding back her resentment and negative emotions. She looked at her father with incomprehension, trying to understand why he was so calm, why he was not worried, telling about how he just gave up the chance to build a normal family. The man looked attentively at his daughter, giving her a chance to spill everything that had accumulated. Then, calmly answered, "I tried. Gave her time to think about the decision and called only a few days after you were at home. But she didn't pick up that day, the next day, or the week after. She couldn't do that to me. She wouldn't leave me. She gave birth to me, carried me under her heart. Why doesn't she love me? Why do all mothers love their children, but mine abandon me?" Joseph gently pulled his daughter close, trying to calm her. Tears were already streaming down Emily's cheeks. Sobs echoed every second. He felt he had started this conversation early. But would there be a good time when the story of a child abandoned by her mother wouldn't resonate with pain? "I don't know, honey, I really don't. The only thing I do know is that I would never leave you. I would never hurt you like that. Would never let anyone take you away." The man fell silent, wondering whether to continue the story or drop the subject. After a few minutes of tense silence, he decided to continue so as not to return to the painful subject. "I tried to tell her what a beautiful little princess you are. I sent her pictures of you, wrote messages, letters to her parents, but all in vain. After a couple years, she blocked me, changed her number, her parents moved. I lost all contact and didn't know how to tell her about my growing angel." He stopped talking. Emily's shoulders shook with sobs. That was all he wanted to say, what she should have known about her birth mother. For several minutes, father and daughter stood in silence. Joseph was giving Emily time to realize the bitter truth. Gradually, she calmed down, her breathing evened out, but the trembling in her body remained. The girl looked into her father's eyes. "But since it happened, since she gave up on us, why didn't you just set up a life with another woman? A lot of people do that. I wouldn't have known she wasn't my mother. How could I lie to you like that my whole life? If I told you that the woman you thought was your mother wasn't, wouldn't you look for your mother? Wouldn't you want to know why you have a stepmother? Would you forgive me? After this?" Emily was silent. She had never before thought about how her father would have lived if he had had another woman. Would he have been happy with her, or would he have continued to blame himself for Emily's motherlessness? Would he have been able to never tell her that she was being raised by her stepmother? Or would she have found out when the time came anyway? The girl looked at her father carefully. There was no sadness in his eyes, no longing or any other feelings that expressed bitterness at the choice she had once made in favor of her own child. She gently put her arms around the man and spoke almost in a whisper. "If you are happy, I will be happy. If you want to build a relationship, you want to be happy and loved, then I will be happy if in your life there will be a worthy woman who will be by your side both in sorrow and in joy. You have the right to do as you see fit." Emily smiled. Joseph couldn't see it, but he could feel it. He could hear it in the timbre of her voice, in the way she snuggled gently against him, and the breathy way she spoke of what she was thinking. The man had never considered that model of a future with someone other than his daughter. She had always occupied all his thoughts, all his feelings. He couldn't imagine bringing a strange woman into the house and telling his daughter to call her mom. But now Emily had grown up, matured, and realized that there must be room for love in everyone's life. Maybe she was right. Perhaps he really should think about finding a worthy woman with whom he could meet his old age. But had he known how such a wish would end, he would have thought several more times before making life unbearable not only for himself, but also for a completely innocent man whom his daughter simply could not accept. No matter how hard he tried to make it happen. Time passed. Emily had already forgotten about that conversation with her father, after which the man seriously thought about his lonely future. After the departure of his daughter to study, despite his inner resistance, he still decided to give himself the opportunity to be happy and began to actively search for a woman with whom he could get closer, so as not to meet old age alone. A couple more months passed. Emily continued to go to school, studying hard but acceptably. In the absence of constant supervision, the girl felt free and completely left to herself, and therefore did not worry about bad grades, failed tests, and scandals with teachers. But only until her father was called to the school. One weekday evening, Joseph's phone rang. The man picked up the phone, and then after a second he looked at his daughter with some displeasure and contempt in his gaze. The girl immediately understood everything and wanted to leave, but suddenly her father gestured for her to return to her seat. Emily exhaled convulsively and sank back into the chair, squeezing her head into her shoulders, and already realizing what was going to happen. "Yes, thank you, I understand," Joseph said into the phone. "I'll try to come in tomorrow at lunchtime and talk to the history teacher about my daughter's progress. Thank you for calling. Have a good day." The last words sounded like a sentence, and Emily knew that under the circumstances she couldn't avoid a serious conversation with her father. She looked at him carefully, hoping he would cool down and not lecture her. But he wouldn't. The man moved closer and started talking. "Do you realize that no one will need you without an education? What do you plan to do with your life? Work as a janitor or maybe a cleaner? Or do you want to find a rich husband who will provide for you and not put you in anything? You will live like a bird in a golden cage, where you will constantly close your mouth and point to your place. Is that the future you want for yourself or what you're trying to achieve?" Emily lowered her eyes to the floor. She didn't like these conversations with her father and didn't expect teachers or the principal to decide to contact her father to discuss her grades at all. The silence was becoming oppressive. She had to say something to avoid looking completely stupid. "I just don't see the point of this story. Why would I want to know what happened before I was born and what I can't influence? It's just unnecessary information that will never be useful to me. Or do you think we're going to have uprisings or presidents being overthrown again? We're in a completely different time. And all this history I'm learning has nothing to do with our lives. I don't need it." Joseph looked at his daughter carefully. For such a young age, the reasoning seemed serious but also childish. "You should learn history, at least so that I don't get called to school on my work days, and so that I don't have to blush, because you don't think a history teacher is an important teacher. But that's my opinion. You've always taught me to stand up for it, to always stand my ground, to always fight back. And now you're saying it's wrong. What do you expect me to do if you can't decide how I should behave? And now you're telling me I have 7 Fridays in a week." Emily jabbed her finger and rose quickly from her seat to avoid further conversation. However, her father held her hand. "My dear, you must understand the difference between standing up for your rights and violating the rights of others. Your rights end exactly where another person's rights begin, and you cannot violate them." The man let go of his daughter's hand, and the daughter, after staring at the gas station for a few seconds, abruptly turned around and went to her room. Joseph sighed heavily, anticipating not the most pleasant conversation with the teacher the next day, and not yet realizing that fate was preparing for him such a welcome and long-awaited gift. Barely free at lunchtime, Joseph hurriedly headed to school. Realizing that he didn't have much free time to spend talking to the teacher, it was easy to find the classroom. However, before he could even enter it, the man froze. Sitting at the teacher's desk was a young and attractive woman who looked completely lost in a classroom full of humming. It took a few seconds until Joseph was able to pull himself together and get out of his strange stupor, confidently entering the classroom and speaking menacingly. Everyone calmed down immediately. "Who taught you to behave like this in front of adults? Or some of you want to replace the teacher and tell a new topic on your own for a grade? Let's also call the principal to see how smart the students in this school are." The class was instantly completely silent. Not even the rustling of textbook pages or any of the other rustles that are so common in classrooms could be heard. The woman gratefully looked up at her savior, trying to figure out where she could see him. "Good afternoon. I was asked to come in to talk to you about my daughter Emily's 8th grade performance, and she's been a little off her game lately. And yesterday the principal pointed out that she's been especially bad in history class. So I thought I'd come here to talk to you in person." The man smiled bewilderedly, realizing that his appearance was a lifeline for the teacher, and therefore there was hope in his soul that she would somehow change her mind about his daughter. But how could she not? The woman nodded slowly, looking around the class and giving the assignment they were to complete while she spoke to the student's father. The classroom continued to be completely silent even after the adults stepped out into the hallway, which was a great indicator of how Joseph's words had affected the overall atmosphere in the classroom. "Do you understand? Your daughter Emily, she does not consider my subject important at all, and therefore she does not learn anything, does not want to answer in class, does not do her homework. I tried to explain to her that it is necessary to study the material at least in order to successfully graduate from school and enter the direction that will be interesting to her in the future. But these words had no effect on your girl, the teacher began. And already at this moment, Joseph realized that the conversation would not be very pleasant. She behaves terribly in class, constantly distracts other students, and sometimes even does everything possible to disrupt the class. I reprimanded her, called the principal to the lessons, used disciplinary measures. However, there was no result. Therefore, I had no choice but to call you to the school for an educational conversation. You must influence your child, otherwise she will not finish school with a good average grade, and this will have a negative impact on her future. I hope you realize that this is serious. Joseph took a deep breath. He had certainly expected nothing good to be said about his daughter during this meeting, but he couldn't even imagine it being this bad. He looked at the teacher carefully and tried to squeeze out at least a semblance of a smile. "I'll do everything I can to influence her," he said. "But you know it's not as easy as it may seem. I'm always at work, doing everything I can to make a decent living for her, so I don't have enough time to raise her." The teacher blushed visibly, whether from the man's words about doing his best and her judging him, or from the strange feeling that was growing stronger in her soul by the minute, making her anxious and breathless. The silence became tense, and the woman made an effort to break it. "Forgive me for an inappropriate question, and why the girl's mother does not participate in her upbringing. Does she also work all the time? Or maybe you have younger children, and she simply does not have time for an adult child, who in this case is left to himself. Just at this age, a girl needs a lot of attention from her mother. Practice shows that it is mothers who have the greatest influence on the unformed psyche of the child. So you talk to your spouse or invite her to school so that I can talk to her. Maybe it will give better results." Joseph's eyes showed a faint pain that hadn't left him in years. He'd always tried to be the best father he could be, investing all his energy and money in his daughter, giving her all his free time. But apparently it was not enough. He could not bring her up to be a decent person, instill a love of education and respect for elders. He could not replace her mother. The man raised his eyes to the teacher, who watched his reaction confusedly. And as hard as it was to admit, he dared to say the words that had been running through his mind for so long. "We have no mother and no one to replace her. Perhaps it was because of me, because of my desire to become a father, because I did not support my beloved in her decision to give up the child. Perhaps I am to blame for the fact that Emily has become so spoiled I can't give her enough time to be around her all the time, to help her with her lessons and personal problems. Perhaps if she had a mother, if I had made more of an effort to find and keep her." If Joseph had been a little more persistent and confident back then, his little daughter Emily would have been a very different person. Perhaps there is some truth in what is happening now and in the words of others. Maybe he's just a bad father who couldn't handle raising his own child. That's all there is to it. Joseph faked a smile, trying to look confident and convincing, pretending that he wasn't hurt by his own words, that he had long ago come to terms with what had happened and knew he was failing as a parent. He stood still, looking at the drawings on the floor in the hallway, and suddenly felt the touch of a warm woman's hand. "I'm sorry, I had no idea you had such a situation in your family," the woman said. "I am sure that you are a wonderful father and you are doing everything you can to make your daughter happy." The teacher looked at the man warmly, trying to convey her sympathy. "I didn't mean to hurt you or hurt you. Emily never said she didn't have a mom, or I wouldn't have brought it up. I'll try to be more sympathetic to her, and given the circumstances, I'll talk to the other teachers. We understand how hard it is for a girl to go through a difficult adolescence, albeit with the support of such a wonderful father." The woman raised her eyes to Joseph, who was looking at her with sincere gratitude. There was so much appreciation and warmth in his gaze that it made her uncomfortable, and she wanted to pull her hand away, but he intercepted it, pressing it to his chest. "Thank you so much. I am very grateful that you are willing to understand our situation and help my daughter with her studies. It's very valuable to us, and I'm sure Emily will do her best to improve her grades as well." "Well, thank you. But you can just call me Mary," the teacher said. "Thank you very much, Mary. You're a wonderful woman. I hope you have a good life. I have to go to work, or I'll be late after my lunch break, and that's not welcome in this company." "Yes, of course. Thank you for taking the time to come and talk to me about your daughter." Joseph turned to leave, but Mary called out to him. "Excuse me, but why don't I come over and talk to you about Emily's studies and grades? Perhaps my words will have some effect on her, and she will decide to get smart. It's not hard for me, if that's what you need." Joseph smiled warmly, nodded, and said gratefully, "I would really appreciate it if you would talk to my daughter, and I confess I would enjoy spending some more time with you. You're a very pleasant woman. We look forward to seeing you tonight then. I think Emily will be glad to have this kind of participation from her teachers." Joseph walked briskly toward the exit. Mary felt her face flush. She had a strange, frightening, yet pleasant feeling for Joseph, and she wouldn't mind spending a little more time with him herself. Emily took the news that her teacher was coming to talk to her about her grades very badly. "I don't need strangers giving me advice on how to live my life," she resented her father as she watched her father prepare for the history teacher's arrival. The man wanted to make the best impression, so he even left work early to clean up the house and prepare something for dinner. He didn't seem to mind his daughter's outrage at all. Joseph was absorbed in his own thoughts. "Do you even hear me?" Emily almost shouted. "I do not want her to come to our house and tell us how to live properly, how to behave, and how to treat her. I don't need her guidance and advice. I can fix my own grades in school, Dad." Joseph perked up, realizing how deeply he had thought about their recent acquaintance. He seemed to have found the one person he was ready to spend his life with, someone who made him feel at ease, who truly understood and supported him. But is it appropriate to date his own daughter's teacher? Does she have a husband or a young man? And most importantly, how will Emily react to the news that her father has fallen in love with the teacher, whom the girl, it turns out, sincerely hates? A few minutes later, the doorbell rang. It was Mary. As promised, the woman looked just fine, not at all reminiscent of the teacher the man had seen during the day at school. Her makeup, beautiful dress, and confident gait made her different from the hunted mouse he'd encountered. But that only added a fire to his gaze and made his new acquaintance even more attractive and alluring. "Good evening, Mary. You're looking very well. It's good to see you." "Good evening. It's nice to see you again, Joseph." Emily looked out of the living room, wondering what was going on in the other room, and since when her father had become so polite and courteous to women. But when the woman saw the girl looking intently in their direction, she immediately returned the businesslike tone and serious look she always used at school. "I hope Emily knows what I'm here for, and that she and I are going to have a serious conversation. You warned her about this, didn't you?" "Of course I did. Emily's waiting for you in the living room. She knows what you've come for." Mary, as if ignoring the confusion on the man's face, went into the room where Emily was waiting for her. The girl was sitting on the sofa, making it clear that she was not happy about the situation and had no plans to talk to her teacher. Mary looked at her carefully and said, "Hi, Emily. Your father, Joseph, is a little worried about your performance in school. I know you're a smart girl, but lately your grades have been slipping. Why don't we talk about what's going on? Look, studying is an important part of life. It helps you decide your future career, develops your thinking skills and self-discipline. I want to help you, but to do that, I need to understand what's wrong. Maybe you find it difficult to learn the material or lack motivation. We'll figure it out together. Emily, you're an amazing girl with a lot of potential. I can see you trying, but something is keeping you from performing at your best. Let's find a solution that will help you learn the program and get you back on track. I will be there for you and will do my best to support you. Joseph is worried because he's worried about your future. He wants you to have lots of opportunities and prospects after school. But this is your life, and you will choose your own path. Our job is to help you go after your goals with ease and confidence." Emily looked at Mary, her teacher. She could see irritation in her eyes. Nevertheless, she decided to answer. "Mary, you are very nice trying to support me, but I know exactly what you're talking about. My studies, my future, my goals, they're all important. However, at the moment I just don't have the desire to make the effort. Maybe that will change later, but right now I'm not interested in cramming textbooks and writing tests. So unless you have any more new information or advice, we have nothing to talk about." Emily said it in a haughty tone, as if challenging her teacher. Joseph, who was in the next room, was upset at his daughter's behavior. Joseph was worried about Emily and wanted her future to be secure. He wanted Emily to grow up to be a decent, independent person, able to stand up for herself, provide for herself, and not need anything. His admonitions are attempts to help guide her on the right path. "I don't need your advice. I know how to live my own life, Emily said. Stop telling me how to behave, what decisions to make, who to talk to. I'm an independent adult who can make decisions that affect my future. Stop telling me what to do. Emily, look, no one is prying into your life. We're trying to help you, to keep you from making serious mistakes that could negatively affect her. You see, we're not telling you what to do or how to do it. We're telling you, guiding you, helping you figure out how to do better. Mary put her soul into every word, trying to be tactful and pleasant, so that Emily understood the essence and stopped resisting, began to learn. But the result was the opposite. Emily looked at the teacher unhappily and spoke haughtily. Tell those who need your advice about how to live better. I don't need them at all, and I'm sure that I can organize my life without your interference. Thank you for coming, but I don't intend to talk to you anymore. My friends are waiting for me. Have a good day. Without waiting for a reply, Emily stood up and headed for the exit. The door slammed. Joseph jumped up and walked quickly into the living room, expecting that it was his daughter's teacher who had left, not her. Looking confused at the obviously upset Mary, he sat down next to her and spoke quietly. She's always been temperamental and explosive, and this has nothing to do with you. She's hard to please. She does things her own way. Do not take her behavior to heart. It has nothing to do with you. Joseph noticed the warmth and appreciation in Mary's eyes and, looking away, continued. Thank you for trying to talk to her. It may not have been successful, but I'm sure she appreciated your attempt to help. But the important thing is that I at least tried to help you, Mary admitted suddenly, smiling softly. Joseph quickly looked at her in surprise. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to try to influence your daughter. I'm sure she and I can still find common ground. She's not what she wants to be. She is very vulnerable inside and hides it behind a mask of detachment. Joseph smiled at Mary and gently touched her hand. I am very grateful that you were able to make time for my child. I understand that you have a lot of things to do and worry about. This is very important to me, and I must admit I was very glad when you came to visit us. I made dinner, by the way. It's not a work of art, of course, but I'd be delighted if you'd stay and try it. Mary agreed. The couple felt the attraction, but in a way they tried to hide it, to suppress the strange feelings growing inside, preventing them from thinking straight. But no matter how people fight fate, they still find themselves subject to feelings and desires. Joseph and Mary are no exception. The relationship between them spiraled rapidly. After a couple of weeks, Mary began to visit her new suitor more often and even stay overnight on weekends. Emily immediately noticed the change in her father's behavior. And at first she was even happy for him, but only until she found out with whom her father was building a relationship, and she wasn't going to accept his choice. What's this all about? Emily grudgingly asked her father during breakfast. What is she doing in our house? Why is she even here? Joseph looked at his daughter with incomprehension and spoke calmly. You yourself wanted me to find a woman with whom I would spend my free time and with whom I would like to meet old age. And I found one. I began to control you less, give a lot of time to myself and my interests, and you became a fully independent person who makes his own decisions, without the constant nagging from me. What's wrong? Why aren't you happy with the choices I've made? Because it's not a choice, she said. You just decided to start a relationship with my teacher so that she would do me favors at school. You decided that this way you could help me improve my grades. Well, I don't need that kind of help from you. Just know that. And you better stop this before it goes too far. Otherwise, you will regret it later, and it will be too late to change anything, the girl said grudgingly, watching her father's facial expressions carefully. And what makes you think that I decided to start a relationship with Mary for the sake of your studies? Joseph asked. How so? It's plain and simple. I was having trouble with this particular subject. I refused to accept help from her the last time she came to our house, and you thought you could improve my grades just like that if you started a relationship with it. She waved her hand toward the bedroom. She waved her hand toward the bedroom where the woman remained, unable to find a decent word. You decided to start a relationship with her to improve my grades, but I don't need that kind of sacrifice. Thank you very much. So, Daddy, you can dump her and live peacefully to yourself without this connection. Joseph listened attentively to his daughter, realizing that she really believed everything that was said and did not accept the possibility that he could just fall in love with his own daughter's teacher. Several tense minutes passed until he decided to tell Emily the truth. "Sweetheart, this has nothing to do with you," he said softly. "I realized that you didn't want control and that you were going to make all your own decisions. I realized that last time. So I left you alone. Gave you the freedom to take charge of your own life and make the decisions that would affect it in one way or another. I'm honestly not even sure I was doing the right thing before, trying to control you all the time. And now you have the opportunity to really make all the decisions yourself, to make the choices that will affect your life, without being constantly controlled by me or your history teacher." The man hesitated, trying to find the right words. "What about Mary? I love her very much indeed, and I want to build a happy relationship with her. They have nothing to do with you. No one's making any sacrifices to get you good grades and a happy future. I just realized at one point that I really liked this woman, and apparently she feels the same way about me." Joseph smiled dreamily, already imagining a happy future with his chosen one, not paying attention to his daughter's unhappy grimace. Suddenly, Emily slammed her fist on the table, looking at her father with displeasure and saying through her teeth, "When I told you that I'd be happy if you found the woman you'd like to grow old with, I didn't mean that you should fall in love with my teacher, who would make my life at school simply unbearable." "You can't just start a relationship with her like that," Emily said grudgingly. "Everyone would know about it. What would happen then? What would they say about you?" Joseph shrugged his shoulders, expressing complete incomprehension of his daughter's displeasure. "What will they say about me? We're all adults and we understand that people fall in love," he replied. "I've spent my life raising you, giving you everything you could ever dream of. And now I want to feel happy and loved. I want to be with a woman who really loves me. I want to grow old with her. I want to spend every day at work, knowing that I will be waiting for me at home with a hot dinner. You see, I have the right to be happy too, no matter how old I am." Emily's gaze grew heavy. She looked at her dreamy father with obvious displeasure as she listened to his wishes and dreams. Emily looked at Joseph with obvious displeasure as she listened to his wishes and dreams. She hadn't expected him to find a woman so quickly. Emily had thought that he would have his personal life already after she left to study, and he was alone. Did he lack love and care from his daughter? Had he been unhappy spending time with her before? Was everything he said really true? But then why did it hurt so much inside? Why did every word he said make her so uncomfortable? Emily slowly leaned toward her father, leaving about 10 centimeters between their faces, and gritted through her teeth. "I'm sorry that you weren't happy because of me, and couldn't build the life you dreamed of because you had to take care of your daughter. Perhaps it would have been better if you had just given up on me. I would have gone to people who loved me instead of thinking of me as a burden." Emily abruptly pulled away from her father and headed for the exit. On the way, she bumped into her history teacher, Mrs. Mary. The woman smiled. "Good morning, Emily. I hope you remember that there's a history test tomorrow. Prepare well to pass it the first time." Mary wanted to touch the girl, but she took a step to the side, not allowing her to touch. Emily looked at the teacher with hatred. "I used to dislike only your subject, but now I sincerely hate you too. I hope you are happy with ruining my life." The girl quickly walked out, ignoring the teacher's incomprehensible look and her father's heavy sigh from the kitchen. She was so hurt, lonely and sad. She didn't think her own father would trade her for a woman he didn't know, be happy with her over his daughter, and choose her in the end. Tears streamed down her cheeks, leaving wet paths, everything squeezed inside. There seemed to be almost no air left in her lungs. The world was fading and becoming unreal. She walked on, not caring what road she traveled, just to get away from the house, not to see her father's happy face, and the one that had taken him away from his daughter. Emily didn't know how much time had passed, but when she came to, it was already dark. Looking around, the girl realized she was in an unfamiliar neighborhood. The fear inside made everything tighten. There was no one around to ask for directions. The phone was left at home. There was no money for a cab either. What to do? Where to go? After thinking for a while, Emily decided to walk in the opposite direction, hoping that on the way she would remember where she had come from. Emily felt herself getting more confused with each new turn. Tears rolled down her cheeks again, but now from helplessness and powerlessness. She didn't know where to go, she didn't know where she was or what would happen to her, and most importantly, whether anyone was even looking for her, or whether her father was only glad that such a burden as she was finally gone from his life. Inside, everything was shrinking from fear, and not understanding what would happen next. It became scary to turn somewhere, to go in an unknown direction. There were sounds around, from which the girl shuddered every time. Complete darkness began to press on the psyche. The heart beat faster. It seemed that it was pounding so hard that it could break the chest. Suddenly, the girl heard some voices behind her back and turned around to see who had come outside to ask for help. There was a group of guys standing in the distance, talking loudly about something. They didn't see Emily, and so she decided to approach them herself to find out where she was and where she should go to get to the right street. But the decision made in fear and panic was not the best one, and Emily soon realized it. But it was too late. Approaching the company of guys, the girl felt a strange anxiety, which was different from the fear she had before. It seemed that getting too close was not the best decision. However, the guys had already noticed her and were watching carefully as the frightened and completely lost girl slowly approached them. A grin appeared on the face of one of the guys, which obviously didn't bode well. But Emily still dared to ask. "Excuse me, can you tell me how to get to Lincoln Street?" Emily stopped a few meters away, asking her question loud enough to be heard clearly in the company of the guys. Even so, no one was in a hurry to answer. One of the guys took a step closer to the girl, followed by a second and a third. They stopped just a couple dozen centimeters away from her. One examined Emily closely, and his smile only grew wider. Leaning over to her, he muttered, "What's a little girl like that doing alone? Baby time is long over at night outside, and you should be in your little crib." All the guys started laughing with glee, which made everything inside the girl feel as if she had fallen. She felt fear and excitement, realizing that it would not be possible to get rid of the attention so easily. But the main thing was to know where to go and not to provoke the guys. There were strange lights in the eyes of some of the strangers that only made Emily more nervous. It took a few dozen seconds before she was able to squeeze out a few words. "I was just taking a walk and got lost. And now I don't know how to get home." She had hoped that such a childish confession would make the boys realize that she was just a child with nothing to take from them. But it seemed that this manner of speaking only served to irritate the boys. One of them came very close to the girl and touched her shoulder. "How nice we are," he said. "You can't tell from the looks of us. You know, I especially like girls who are obedient, who will do whatever you tell them to do and don't ask questions. You're like that, aren't you?" The boy looked into Emily's eyes, and she could see the evil lights dancing in his gaze. She wanted to run, but it was too soon. And where would she go if she didn't know how to get home? And running, not knowing where to go, wasn't the best solution. She'd be exhausted too quickly, and this group of guys would easily catch up with her. So we have to somehow turn the situation around so that they tell her where to go, and only then start running. "I'm sorry, but I just want to go home. My dad's waiting for me there. He must be very worried about me," Emily said in a shaky voice. Emily walked down the unfamiliar street. She looked around, trying to get her bearings. "Excuse me, can you tell me where to go? This is my first time here." Two guys approached her closely. One of them ran his fingertips through her hair. Emily felt an uncomfortable sensation but stayed where she was, trying not to provoke them. "If you behave and do everything we say, we'll walk you home ourselves afterwards so no one else can touch you," the other guy smirked. "But only if you're good, and if you get cranky." He lowered his voice deliberately, giving it an ominous tone. Emily realized she couldn't expect any help from these guys. She thought feverishly about what she should do. She couldn't think of a single sensible way to hide or get away from a group of tough guys who clearly looked stronger and tougher than she was. Her heart was pounding faster and faster, blood pounding in her temples. "So, will you behave yourself?" The other guy asked again, continuing to stroke her hair. "Or do you want to play naughty girl and get punished?" He leaned very close to her ear. "Hey, stop messing with her," shouted irritably the third guy in the crowd. "Let's get out of here. How long can we stand here? We're attracting too much attention." He moved toward Emily with determination. Realizing that there might not be another chance, she ran down the street, not looking back and trying to ignore her racing heart. A second's hesitation from the boys gave her a small head start, but soon she heard them catching up to her quickly. Emily realized what would happen if they caught her. She ran as hard as she could, feeling her legs jacking up. Turning corners, winding streets, her eyes were already swimming in multicolored circles from lack of air. The realization came that there was no escape. and then Emily bumped into someone on the sidewalk. She lost consciousness, but felt someone's strong arms pick her up. The next thing she knew, it was darkness, no thought, no feeling. When Emily regained consciousness, there was light all around. She was lying on a pillow, her body aching unpleasantly, reminding her of her recent adventures. Her throat was dry, her eyes ached from the tears shed last night. Looking around, the girl realized she was in a hospital room and tried to raise herself, but she felt dizzy and weak. Slowly lowering herself back onto the bed, she decided to wait for someone to come and explain the situation. Suddenly, Emily noticed a rustle to her left and was startled to see the boy sleeping peacefully in the chair. Her insides clenched with fear. Had she been caught after all? Had they done something to her? And now someone from that company was sitting next to her, so that she wouldn't say anything unnecessary? Tears came to her eyes, and the girl decided to leave the room and find a doctor on her own. But when she tried to get out of bed, the guy woke up. He looked carefully at Emily and, smiling slightly in a sleepy voice, said, "I'm glad you've come to your senses." The doctor said that Emily had just had a lot of exhaustion and excitement happen to her. But the guy was still worried that those bullies might have done something to her. The doctors didn't want to leave him, but since Emily's cell phone was dead and she had fallen into his arms, he was allowed to stay and monitor her condition until her parents arrived, who were due to arrive soon. In the meantime, he would guard her sleep as best he could. The guy smiled again, and that smile somehow made him feel much calmer. "So you're not one of those guys who chased me so hard?" Emily asked tiredly, slowly lowering herself back onto the bed and closing her eyes. "I was already scared that you were with them and sitting next to me to keep me from saying too much or convincing me that everything was my wish." Emily exhaled convulsively, trying to catch her breath. "Don't worry, it's okay," Joseph replied. "They've all been detained until the circumstances are clarified. They tried to prove to me that they hadn't touched you, but I didn't believe them. Now let them think about their behavior behind bars, at least until you testify." The boy moved a little closer to Emily, peering gently into her tired and frightened eyes. "Didn't your parents teach you that it was dangerous to walk alone on dark streets at this hour? What if I hadn't been around the corner? What if they'd caught up with you before you could get to me? Do you even think about the consequences of your decisions?" Emily felt herself blush thickly. She didn't want to be lectured by a complete stranger. But there was truth in his words, and she decided to tell him everything that had happened that night so that she wouldn't seem frivolous. The boy listened to her attentively, and then, with a sigh, spoke. "Yes, I understand you perfectly well. I myself had such things, misunderstanding from parents, quarrels and scandals. But you know, once my history teacher gave me a really good advice that changed my life. You know what she said? That no matter what emotions reign in my soul, no matter how much I want to leave, to stop communicating with my parents and get rid of their overly intrusive care, they are still my parents, who gave me life and sacrificed a lot to provide for me, to bring me up and give me a chance for a normal life. That's why I should treat them with respect, tolerate their quirks, just as they once tolerated my childish whims and tears. Of course, I couldn't fully accept their behavior and forget their mistakes. But you know, I think that advice did help me to be easier on them, to make concessions and to forgive some things." Emily lowered her eyes to the floor. Another piece of advice, another admonition, another attempt to pry into her life that she was so sick of. She sighed heavily, looked at the guy carefully and mouthed, "Thank you so much for saving me tonight. But I'll figure out how to live my life on my own. I don't need your advice and guidance. I'm sorry. I'd like to learn from my mistakes. Okay?" "No, you've got it all wrong," he smiled. "I was just sharing my life experience with you. I didn't want to teach you how to live or change your views and attitudes. I just told you how I see the situation, that's all." He went back into his thoughts. "I just realized I should have been closer to my mother. It was too late. At a time when I had no way to get close to her, or just have a heart-to-heart talk with her. Some mistakes teach valuable lessons, but the toll they take on our lives is too high." A few seconds later, there was a rustle in the hallway, and Emily's worried father came running into the room. He seemed to have aged considerably in just one night, and even changed in his face. The girl watched with incomprehension and some sympathy as his gaze frantically traveled over her, and then stopped on the boy who had remained close by. Joseph rushed to embrace his daughter, pulling her gently against him. Tears were rolling down the man's cheeks, and it looked so unusual that the girl was finally confused and froze in indecision, not understanding what to do and how to behave. She gently pulled away from her father, looking into his eyes and asking in all seriousness, "What's the matter with you? I've come home late before and stayed overnight at a friend's house without permission. And you've never been so worried?" "I always knew where you were and what was wrong with you." The man's voice trembled, and that made her feel even more uncomfortable. "And this time it seemed to me that something terrible had happened, that you would never come home." She was not used to seeing her father in such a state, not used to seeing him weak and depressed, and so everything inside clenched unpleasantly at the unfolding picture. She turned to the boy, who was watching father and daughter closely, and sighed. "Admittedly, I did get myself into a bit of a mess. But thanks to this young man," Emily pointed to the boy beside her bed, "it's all over, and I'm safe and sound now. I'm lucky I met him on the street, or I'm afraid to imagine what might have happened." She was silent, realizing that it was better for her father not to know the whole story, especially given the state he was in. Joseph immediately turned to the stranger and began to hug him. "Thank you so much. Thank you so much for taking care of my daughter. She's such an impulsive but good girl. She's very lucky to have such a compassionate young man. I'm afraid to even imagine what could have happened if she had met one of those criminals that frequent the streets at night. There has been so much bad news already." The boy noticed the pain flashing in Joseph's eyes, and turning back to Emily, he noticed the pleading in her eyes. And it all became clear. He made the decision to keep quiet about everything that had happened as well. To calm the man down and not to complicate the life of the rescued girl, gently pulling away from the man's strong embrace, the guy adjusted his clothes and spoke in a calm voice. "You know, I think that's what anyone in my place would do. Leaving such a beautiful girl in trouble is not gentlemanly, so I couldn't do anything else. Besides, I didn't do anything wrong. I just brought her to the hospital after she passed out in the street." Noticing the anxiety, if not horror, in Joseph's eyes, the guy immediately hurried to continue. "But the doctors said she was just exhausted, and that's the only reason she passed out. She's completely fine. They'll take some tests in a couple of hours, and if everything is fine, they'll let her go home." He smiled, trying to make his words positive and convincing. But there was still anxiety in Joseph's gaze. He looked at his watch and then at his daughter and spoke. "I have to report to work now. I have a promotion coming up that will pay for my princess's education and I can't miss it. But as soon as you get all your tests done and are told you can go home, I'll come right over to pick you up. Okay, sweetie? Or, if you want, I can ask Mary to meet you." No, Emily answered firmly, not even wanting to hear her father's suggestion. "I'll get home on my own, and I'm not going to let your Mary meet me. I don't need her help. She's the reason I left home. She's the reason everything happened. And you don't understand that, and you stubbornly don't see it," she said resentfully, folding her arms across her chest and turning away from her father, clearly showing that she didn't want to continue the conversation. Joseph sighed heavily, trying to understand how to please his daughter and keep his own happiness. At that moment, the stranger spoke. "You know, I'm on the car. Today I have the day off so I can take your daughter home myself after the doctors say that she is fine. Then you won't have to take off work and risk a promotion, and your beautiful daughter won't have to make concessions to be met by someone else." The guy smiled, waiting for an answer. "Of course, if you don't mind." Joseph looked at Emily carefully. Even in this situation, she was still cold and distant, and it bothered him a lot. After a few minutes, the man made his decision. "Fine, but if she doesn't want to go with you, just call me and I'll call a cab or come myself. It was nice to meet you." Joseph fell silent, realizing he didn't recognize the name of his daughter's savior. "Brian. It's nice to meet you too. I hope this isn't the last time we see each other." "It's nice to see such loving fathers," the boy smiled, extended his hand, and Joseph shook it in return, then walked briskly out of the room. "I can get home on my own. I don't need your help," she said almost in a whisper, despite Brian's presence. "I'm sorry, I didn't hear you." The boy moved closer. At that moment, Emily felt her heart beat faster. "I'm telling you, I'm capable of getting home on my own," she said louder, deliberately moving away from her savior. "I don't need anyone's help or handouts. Thank you. But it seemed like you couldn't have gotten home on your own last night. Plus, your cell phone is still dead, and the hospital doesn't have a charger. How were you going to get home?" The guy reacted unhappily. "And you don't have money for a cab. Emily realized that she was in a desperate situation and would have to ask her nighttime savior for help anyway. "Okay," she muttered. There was a pause for a few minutes in which everyone was thinking about something else until the girl made up her mind. "Thank you for saving me. I'm afraid to imagine how things would have ended that night if you hadn't been there. Probably nothing good." "You're welcome," the boy replied simply and sincerely, looking into the eyes of the saved girl. "I couldn't leave such a beautiful girl alone. It was good that I went outside at that very time. It was like something was beckoning me to stand there. Fate, I guess." The girl was embarrassed by what she heard and hurried to look away, so as not to see the guy's smile, which gave her a wave of goosebumps inside. Brian, on the other hand, watched the girl's reaction carefully, trying not to miss anything and admiring the one that saw his soul. Emily was indeed discharged home. The tests were normal. However, the girl was advised not to overexert herself. She was released from classes for the next few days and recommended to undergo a full examination to find out the cause of fainting. As promised, Brian drove the girl home. Emily took her time getting out of his car, scrutinizing the guy. After a few minutes of silence, he asked, "Do you want me to walk you straight to the door, or can you walk yourself?" "I can do it myself," she replied. "Thank you for coming to my rescue and driving me home, despite my unbearable temper. And thank you for just being there for me the whole time. It was very important to me." Emily slowly leaned over to the guy and kissed him gently on the cheek. The warm touch of her lips sent shivers down Brian's body, and at that moment he realized that next to him was not just an accidentally rescued girl, but the one given to him by fate. The guy took Emily's number, and from that moment the couple's communication spiraled rapidly. After a couple of months, Brian offered the girl to meet, and she agreed. The relationships with him became a kind of outlet, which helped to distract from the constant reflections on his father and his new passport. Toward the end of the school year, Joseph decided to make Mary a proposal, so that in the summer to play a modest wedding and legalize their relationship. And that was the last straw in Emily's patience. She did not intend to watch her father build a life with the one she hated so much. And so the girl made a sharp, in her opinion, the only right decision to move out, and to tell her father about it she decided to immediately. "What are you leaving after the 9th grade?" Joseph said with displeasure, pacing from corner to corner in the living room and trying to calm down, so as not to say too much to his daughter. "What about higher education? What about the prospects you've been striving for all these years? Are you really just ready to give up everything because of another whim?" And at that moment Mary came to him, who gently took his hand and looked into his eyes and gently said, "Let her make her own decision. She is an adult and can be responsible for her actions. We all learn from our mistakes. Maybe this will be a great lesson for her on how not to act in a situation, or maybe she will actually get what she wants out of life." Joseph exhaled convulsively. He wasn't ready to make that kind of decision from his daughter, and so the idea that it might be the right one seemed somehow unrealistic. Still, he decided to listen to his chosen one and closed his eyes and spoke. "Maybe you're right, and Emily really just needs more freedom. I just wanted to say that her decision seems wrong to me, and that I think it will lead to a completely different outcome than she expects. That's all. I didn't forbid her from making her own decision, nor did I say that she should give up her aspirations to please me. I'm just trying to keep her safe." "I understand, darling," Mary said softly, looking into Joseph's eyes. "But she's a big girl, and she can decide for herself how to be, how to behave, how to act in any given situation. She's not a little child, after all." The man sank down in his chair. He realized that it was really true, that it was time to give his daughter the opportunity to make her own decisions and dispose of her life as she saw fit. But the anxiety and worry wouldn't let him go. He looked up at his daughter, and only at that moment did he notice the unkind grin on her face. And in the next second, Emily spoke with displeasure and anger. Of course, who'd have doubted she'd say that? I've always been a bone in her throat, and now that she's had a chance to get rid of me early, she's not going to miss it. Still, I made the right decision when I realized it was time to move out. Otherwise, I would have had to endure 2 more years of a disgruntled look on my face and some stupid accusations against me. Emily forgot to put her shirt back on, or didn't wash her plate, or behaved inappropriately in front of guests. She thought that then a calm and measured life would come. As soon as I get kicked out of my own house, right resentment and dissatisfaction with the situation could be heard in Emily's voice. It was clear that the girl was not thrilled with the decision, but thought it was the right one. Confused by his daughter's words, Joseph muttered, "What does Mary have to do with it, if you yourself decided to move out after 9th grade? It's your decision, no one imposed it. Why, when Mary supported it, do you think she wants to evict you? I don't understand anything." Joseph looked at his daughter carefully, hoping she would realize the error of her ways. But Emily became even more disgruntled. "Of course you never see what's wrong," she glanced obliquely at Mary, who looked incomprehensively back and forth at her future husband and Emily, not knowing whether to intervene or remain silent. Joseph rose slowly and approached his daughter. Placing his hands on her shoulders, he looked into her eyes. "Sweetheart, why do you always have some strange competition with the woman I truly love? She hasn't replaced you for me. She hasn't become the only one I love. She has no prejudice against you. Contrary to your speculation, she's trying to connect with you, to get closer, and you're pushing her away. She's not replacing your mother, and she never intended to. But can't you have a warm relationship for my sake?" The man looked at his daughter with hope and tenderness, but her gaze became hard and displeased. "You knew from the beginning that I didn't approve of your association with my teacher. What made you think I would be thrilled to marry her? It's your decision, not mine. I don't have to support it. I'm sure she's only with you because of the house and work. Not the love you're talking about. You can see it in her." Mary sighed heavily, realizing that building a good relationship with Emily would be difficult, but she had no idea how much. Joseph replied calmly, "You're right, it's my choice and it's not your place to judge it. It's not like I'm judging your Brian and I'm trying to build a good relationship with him, because he didn't interfere with our family, try to take me away from you, or tell me how to live my life. Since you're so happy with her, you should know that you lost me because you chose her." Her Emily shouted to her father through gritted teeth. She raised her head proudly and went to her room, hoping that the conversation would influence her father's decision to marry Mary. But it didn't, and the girl decided to move away from her father as soon as she received her diploma. Emily entered college in another city and from the first days lived with Brian. He rented an apartment, paid for groceries and expenses. While the girl was studying, Brian loved her unconsciously and was willing to do anything to make her happy and stay close to her. Despite her father's protests that it was too early for Emily to live with a boyfriend, she did her own way, as always. Joseph soon reconciled, taking Brian's promise that his daughter Emily would definitely get an education and only after that become a happy mom and wife. And boy did he promise that he would. Mary and Joseph played a wedding, to which Emily decided not to come. She did not want to be present at that celebration, which she absolutely did not approve of. But Brian was not in favor of such a decision. "Why don't you want to be there for your father on such an important day?" he said. "I think he'd like it if you could come, especially since the wedding is in the summer, before school starts, which is very convenient for you. They made sure you could get to their celebration without missing school." The guy watched with incomprehension as the girl tore the wedding invitations into small pieces, sitting on the living room floor. "I won't go where I'm not welcome," Emily replied. "And I wouldn't be welcome there, believe me." "But why do you think that? They sent you an invitation, and they took the time and effort to make it and sign it. They even invited you to come early to help organize the party. This is one of the most important days of your father's life." That's right, in his life, he made the decision to marry that witch. Despite the fact that I hate her, despite our terrible relationship, despite the fact that she treated me abominably and told me how to live my life, what to do, what to wear, despite the fact that I am an adult, an independent person. And she is the reason that our relationship with my father, which he spent so long building and cherishing, has shattered. I don't want to see him choose her over me. I don't want to see him give up our good relationship for someone who only values a spacious house and a big wallet. Emily closed her eyes and sighed heavily, trying to calm down and get her thoughts in order. She didn't want to think any more about the fact that her father had chosen some other woman over her, that he had made her the center of his life, and that he had made the decision to marry in spite of her displeasure. But Brian kept asking questions, trying to figure out exactly what had happened and why Emily had this attitude toward her future stepmother. "But she didn't do anything bad to you, right? She just fell in love." "She didn't fall in love," Emily cut her off. She came into someone else's family and made her own rules that I had to follow. And my father, like a blind sheep, didn't want to see her leading him around and making him a tosser. Well, maybe he was just really in love with her, Brian suggested. He wanted to do everything he could to make her happy. I love you very much too, and I'm doing everything I can to make sure that you don't need anything and can live the life you want. I always fulfill your requests. Emily looked at him unhappily. She didn't want to continue this conversation, and she certainly didn't want to waste her time explaining to him the problem and the reasons for his bad attitude. Just trust me. She's not at all who she says she is, the girl said. She's a disgusting, mercenary woman who will do anything to keep my father on a leash and bounce around on her hind legs. I know exactly what she's trying to accomplish, and she got it in the end. I tried to save him from this mistake. I tried to show him that he became just a slave who does not know anything and cannot distinguish lies from the truth. But he didn't listen to me. He made the choice she whispered to him. Let him suffer now. Brian was silent, realizing that the conversation would not lead to any expected result, and therefore there was no point in continuing it. Emily had almost completely stopped communicating with her father. She rarely returned his calls, hardly ever read his messages, and stopped coming home completely. She still considered him a traitor, didn't want to accept his decisions, and couldn't let go of the resentment that sat in her soul. Emily finished her studies and started working in her profession. 6 months later, Brian proposed to her. She accepted. It was decided to just sign, not to make a lavish wedding, and just spend the day for themselves. That's how it all worked out. They began to live together, to build their family life, and therefore there was no time to worry about her father and his new wife. Emily was completely immersed in her life, not yet realizing what a surprise awaits her from fate. One weekend, Emily's phone rang. She looked at the screen and saw Mary's name. Goosebumps ran down her body. Her stepmother was calling her, and she was the last person she expected to call. The girl blocked the screen, not wanting to pick up the phone, realizing that she wouldn't hear anything good. Suddenly, Brian's voice sounded. "Who's calling you on your day off? Is it work again? Is there a problem?" "No, my stepmother has decided to ruin my life by showing up again," Emily answered. "It's been so long, and she can't stand the fact that I don't want to be around their family. I'm sick of it." "Well, maybe something's wrong. She's not just calling. Pick up the phone, at least to see what they want you to do." The guy looked out from behind the corner, looking carefully at the girl, who stood near the phone with a disgruntled expression. "You just won't blame yourself," he continued. "Then, if something's really wrong, and she's not just calling, you'll pick up the phone. Come on." Emily looked down at the phone, the ringing stopped, and she exhaled shakily. But at the same moment, the call came again. There was a strange excitement inside that defied description. After hesitating for a few seconds, she decided to pick up the receiver. "Hello," she asked grudgingly, expecting to hear anything but what Mary would say in the next few seconds. "Joseph. He didn't survive our automobile accident. The funeral will be on Monday. Will you be able to make it, or won't you be expected?" Emily slowly slid to the floor. She expected to hear anything but that. Several minutes of complete silence passed before Brian looked out of the kitchen and was immediately stunned. His wife's face was as pale as a sheet, her eyes full of terror. He slowly approached her, looking into her eyes and asking with a tremor in his voice, "What's the matter? What did your stepmother say to you? What happened?" He crouched down beside her, trying somehow to figure out from the girl's look what had happened. "Daddy's gone" was the only thing the girl could whisper, and tears came to her eyes. She dropped her head to her knees, trying to suppress her sobs. Fear, pain, misunderstanding, and other negative feelings raged inside. Panic was rising more and more. It was getting harder to breathe with each passing second. Breaths were being taken. Circles appeared in my eyes. The funeral had gone smoothly. Emily didn't remember exactly what had happened, and the only moment she remembered was Mary, who was now confined to a wheelchair forever. It had been several months since the tragedy. Emily still hadn't fully recovered. She couldn't accept that her father was gone, that she would never be able to hold him again, to hear his voice. But as they say, trouble does not come alone. Emily's health took a serious hit. She was constantly visiting doctors, and sometimes even lay in hospitals for constant checkups. She lost a lot of weight, almost ceased to be happy about simple things, did not leave the house, and often cried. She literally wore herself out, not giving her body the slightest opportunity to recover from the tragedy. And she herself understood it perfectly well, but did not want to change anything. As time went on, the situation only got worse and worse. Emily thought it couldn't get any worse. After Emily's father died, her stepmother Mary said she needed her stepdaughter's help. She explained, "The doctors said I need constant care. I find it difficult to do simple household chores on my own, even cooking a meal. I don't have money for a caregiver. I understand that we had a bad relationship. You never loved me and didn't want your father to associate life with me. But since we've become related, we should help each other through a difficult situation." Brian expected Emily to react negatively, however, she just nodded silently. She later told her husband, "I don't care. I'm just going to hire a caregiver for her. I hate her. I don't want to see or hear from her unnecessarily. I don't want to take care of the woman who ruined my father. She's not my family. I'll never be nice to her. I'd rather give my last dime to a caregiver. But I won't live in the same house with her. I don't care." Mary heard Emily's words but didn't object, realizing her stepdaughter wouldn't change her mind. It pained Brian to see his mother-in-law in need of help. He noticed that Mary looked at him carefully, and she thought his face looked familiar. As promised, Emily hired Mary a caregiver for her care and household chores. It wasn't cheap, so Emily took on extra work, staying late, doing what she could to pay the caregiver and have money for herself. This strain was taking a toll on Emily's health. She was losing her attractiveness and her health. Brian's entreaties to take on less work didn't work. Emily refused to help, seeing it as her area of responsibility. Over time, Emily's health deteriorated greatly. She constantly went to doctors, took tests, but no one could understand the cause. Doctors said that she was exhausting herself, not giving rest, and nervous tension leads to exhaustion. Brian looked at the doctor hopefully. "Isn't there anything that can be done? She's literally withering away, so young, and she has no vitality at all. She looks exhausted and tired. Isn't there anything we can do to help her? Are we just going to leave her like this?" The doctor was silent for a while, then replied sadly, "I'm sorry, but there's nothing I can do. She is exhausting herself, and until she stops doing that, her condition will not improve. So you need to talk to your wife on your own. Explain to her how important this is, that she has to live for you, for your happy future. There's nothing I can do until your wife wants to live. Do you understand me?" Brian walked out of the doctor's office depressed. He realized that nothing was going to work because Emily wouldn't listen to him. He had tried talking to her, urging her to eat better, sleep better, work less. But all these talks had no effect. He realized that his entreaties were useless, and there was no way out. Brian was not going to give up, so he decided to make one more attempt. "Honey, how about we go on vacation? There'll be lots of good food. We'll vacation together and spend some quality time together. We should do that, don't you think?" "I have to work. I can't go anywhere yet. I can't just take days off. I can't let my bosses down. If I don't, I won't get my bonus. And if I don't get the extra money, what's the point of my job? If I don't bring anything to our family?" Brian looked carefully into the girl's eyes and saw so much pain and despair in them that he felt uncomfortable. He took the girl's hands in his own, gently moved closer to her, and gazed into her eyes. "Please, Emily, for my sake. Let's take a vacation, relax, spend time together, and taste so many delicious things. It's been so long since we've been alone together, without work and worries and cares. Let's just be together. I'll pay for the caregiver, all your mother's expenses. Let's just be together." Emily looked at her husband with tired eyes. She didn't want to decide anything, didn't want to take part in any of these fights, didn't want anything from this life. The silence was becoming tense, and Brian realized that his wife's answer was obvious, but he hoped she would agree to spend some time with him. "I'm sorry, but I don't want to pass my responsibilities on to you. I promised my stepmother that I would provide her with a caregiver, and that responsibility is mine. You don't have to take over. We'll definitely spend time together when I get a promotion, or when I don't need a nurse. It just takes a little time." "Okay," Brian replied, realizing that his wife wasn't going to change her mind or agree to drop everything to spend time with him. But Brian and Emily were not destined to spend a single vacation together as husband and wife. One night the girl became very ill. The ambulance came quickly, but the doctors could not help in any way. severely exhausted body almost did not fight for life. And a few days later, Brian received a call from the intensive care unit with sad news. Funeral arrangements were made quickly. Emily had never said where or how she wanted to be buried, but Brian was certain that she should be next to her father, that this was the place she rightfully belonged. He handled the arrangements entirely on his own, not allowing anyone to interfere with his advice and guidance. He knew how best to do things and understood perfectly well how things should be. He had buried a loved one before. But at the time of the last funeral, the last time he had seen his mother's lifeless face, he had thought he would never be hurt like that again. But Brian was wrong. This time the pain seemed dozens, if not hundreds of times worse. He wanted to scream, to cry, to be hysterical, but he held on with all his might. He knew that his tears wouldn't help, and probably would only hurt Emily's loved ones more. That day had left an indelible mark on his heart that he would never get rid of, that would always be with him, and that he would have to accept and learn to live with. He could not imagine that he had so little time to enjoy life with the one he loved. After the funeral, the tears flowed. He could not calm down, he could not pull himself together. So after the funeral was over, after breakfast, he came to his sick mother-in-law's bedroom to do what he had long dreamed of. He fell into her lap, shaking with sobs that he could no longer hide. Pain, resentment, longing, and frustration all blended into one emotion that would not let him go. He didn't want to live, didn't want to do anything else in this life. He felt like he was all alone again, a lost and unwanted boy who wandered the empty streets at night. "I remembered you at my husband's funeral," Mary said. "You looked at me like that." "No, but I didn't remember that look until later. You were the lost boy who needed support and advice. You're the Brian who couldn't recover from losing his mother and who didn't even want to live. You've grown so mature, so strong and beautiful. I knew you would become a beautiful man, but strong people need care and support sometimes too. Need someone to say a few affectionate words, to comfort them in misfortune and help them cope with the most intense sadness. It takes someone to support them, to stay by their side and sincerely believe that everything will be fine. And if you have no one else, if you yourself no longer believe that something else good is in store for you in the future, then I will do it in your place." Mary gently ran her hand through the man's hair, inviting him to share her sorrow and trying to convey in such a simple gesture all the love and care she felt in her soul. She wanted to share it with someone who really needed it. Why me again? Why am I alone again? Why does fate have such sad plans for me? Why can't I just be happy? Can't help but lose the people I care about more than myself. Why can't I? I just can't be happy like all the people around me. And why things don't work out the way I want and desire. Why? Brian continued to lie on his mother-in-law's lap. Tears flowed silently down his cheeks. It seemed that he had already accepted the inevitability of his fate, that he no longer resisted it at all, and that he was ready to accept everything that was happening to him. But Mary was sure that it was not yet over. "You know, for every major trial, fate sends you a gift, something you've wanted or needed for a long time," she said. "She doesn't just send you trials, she tests you for resilience to thank you afterwards for all your suffering, for your perseverance and persistence, and for the fact that you don't just give up and go to the end. Now you will always have me. I will be there for you. I will support you in any situation, always help you with advice and deeds if you need it. I will help you to get out of this abyss, as I once helped you to cope with the darkness that surrounded you so quickly. I won't leave you alone. I'm not going to let you just give up. Just remember that you are not alone." The woman gently pressed the man to herself, trying to convey all her warmth and confidence that tomorrow would be better than today, and that in the near future everything would be much better than now. The next morning, all the neighbors were shocked that Brian had fired his mother-in-law's caregiver and started taking care of her on his own. He realized that he could not and did not want to stay alone, and that the best solution would be to spend his life with the person who would really help in a difficult moment, who would be there for him, who would support and help with advice, and who would not betray and would not leave in a difficult situation. Brian didn't just start doing all the household chores on his own. He also worked hard on his mother-in-law's health. He wanted to make sure that her life was safe and that she would be able to live many more happy years, even if she was confined to a wheelchair. In the meantime, the doctors were giving a good prognosis, and that made the guy feel much calmer. He was able to calm down a little and began to try to live on. Now, not only without his mother, with whom he once parted not on the most pleasant note, but also without his favorite woman, for whose sake he was ready for a lot, but could not do anything to convince her to live on. Perhaps there was a reward ahead of him for such a serious ordeal, but maybe it was just an experience that he will just have to accept and move on with his life. A mother of many children takes a job with a fading millionaire widower, and barely had she sat down at the piano. Marian looked at the note for what must have been the 10th time, rereading it. No, the handwriting was legible, but the content. Marian, I'm sorry, but I can't go on like this. I've fallen in love with another woman, and today she and I are leaving for another city. Don't look for us. Tell the children I love them. Matthew. She slowly sat back in her chair and waved the note away, as if that little scrap of paper could provide some kind of coolness. It just can't be. Marian muttered quietly. No, she'd noticed something strange going on with Matthew lately. She had noticed it, but she didn't want to believe it. It was true what they said about a husband cheating the wife would be the last to know. He told her he was working hard, that he was tired, that he was working late, that he was going out in the evenings and weekends. Even the kids seemed to have begun to suspect something. At least the eldest, Stephen, he's 14 now. Marian, at his age, would probably realize by now that her mom and dad don't like each other and are only together because they have nowhere to live separately. Of course, in front of the children, Marian pretended that everything was fine. Daddy just works hard, she answered all their questions and smiled, trying to make it look believable. He does it for us. She saw Stephen frown incredulously. He hadn't asked his mother anything, perhaps because he didn't want to bother his younger brother and sister. Or maybe he thought the adults would figure it out for themselves. Suspicions had plagued Marian for a long time. She tried to ignore them as best she could. Her blonde, long hair stuck to the front passenger seat of her husband's car. Though Marian's was dark walnut-colored and long past her shoulders, she wouldn't let it go. Long hair isn't practical when you have 3 kids. Just giving a lift to one of his colleagues, she thought. Was Marian thinking about hair or acquaintances? The smell of someone else's sweet feminine perfume from his clothes, the sound of a text message arriving on his phone at 2 a.m. Matthew, who'd been going to the bathroom for an hour at a time just to go have a beer with his friends. And his friends who hid their eyes if they happened to run into Marian. All of this she found an explanation for. Why, she thought, clutching the note in her hands. Why did I make excuses for him when it was so obvious? Just because I was used to trusting him? Or because I've never cheated anyone myself? In 15 years of marriage, Marian had never once lied to Matthew, even about the smallest things. Or maybe she was just afraid of ruining their stable, steady world she'd grown so accustomed to over the years. Don't wake trouble while it's quiet, Marian's grandmother was fond of saying. Marian didn't wake her up, just pretended everything was the same as before, until he decided to make the first move. Mum, are we having dinner tonight? Stephen came into the kitchen. He had always picked up her moods like radar, and now he knew at once that something was wrong with his mother. Marian twitched, tried to hide the note, but the son jumped to her in 2 steps, practically pulled the paper from his mother's hands, read it in a couple of seconds, sighed in a mature way, without surprise, as if he had long been prepared that such a thing could happen. I see. Have you called him yet? Why? What do you mean, why? The eldest son sat down next to me. Of all the children, he was the most like Marian, the same dark hazel hair, expressive green eyes and straight, neat nose. But unlike the soft Marian, Stephen was serious and sensible from childhood, as if he was preparing for the fact that he would have to become the head of the family. We'll have to discuss divorce, alimony. Who will pay for the flat? We have a mortgage for another 5 years. You're probably right. We should just talk to him about it. I just don't believe it's real yet. His son sighed and put his hand over hers. I know it's very difficult for you right now, Mum, but you and I both knew this was going to happen at some point. How long has he been cheating on you? 3 years? 5 years? Marian flinched as if struck by a blow. I don't know. Let's not talk about it. You'd better call the younger ones. We must have supper. Stephen got up. I'll get them. You're not going to tell them yet? No. I'll contact your father first. Marian threw the note into the rubbish bin. Matthew didn't answer his phone or text messages. Marian even called him at work. They said Matthew had tendered his resignation a few days earlier, and they never saw him again. Marian also called some of his friends. They replied that they didn't know anything either. Only one of the mates, Alex, said that Matthew had told him about his plans to leave his wife and kids and run off with his mistress. I thought he was joking. Alex sighed. It turned out to be a joke. You knew Matthew was cheating on me, didn't you? Marian asked. There was silence in the phone for a few seconds, but then Alex answered. Yes. Okay, said Marian. I understand. Thanks for telling me everything. She finished the calls, looked thoughtfully out the window. The children were already asleep, and now she had time to think and decide what to do next. After Molly, their youngest daughter, had been born 7 years ago, it was clear that Marian wouldn't be working for a long time. And what are you going to do there? Her husband said then. Even if you worked double shifts at your hospital, your salary wouldn't even be enough for one child, let alone 3. Marian sighed. She realized that nurses weren't paid that much. Quit, Matthew continued. Take care of the house and the children, and we'll have enough money. So she listened to her husband and resigned from the hospital where she had worked for many years. Of course, they were very upset. There was already a shortage of nurses, and there were very few responsible and careful professionals like Marian. She didn't really want to quit. She enjoyed her work, but it was difficult to combine it with caring for her husband and children. After she was fired, Marian didn't know where to put herself for the first time. She was used to being torn between her shifts, her husband, her children, and household chores. Only maternity leave was a rest for her, but only from work, because the rest of her duties were not canceled. Now she could take Molly and Alex to nursery in the morning and Stephen to school. On the way back, she had to go grocery shopping, then do the dishes, put the toys away, throw things in the wash, sweep and mop the floors. And then it was time to make lunch so that by the time it was ready, she could run to pick up the younger ones from kindergarten. Marian used to run to the school to pick up Stephen, but after the little sister started kindergarten, the eldest of the family protested. I'm a big boy, he told his mother. I can walk to school on my own. You're only 9? Marian objected. Stephen only furrowed his eyebrows stubbornly. The school's near the house. You've got 2 kids to drag from kindergarten, and then you have to follow me. And I'm ashamed to walk with my mom, like a little kid, honestly. His mom sighed and agreed. Once Stephen had made up his mind about something, there was no changing his mind. In time, Marian fell into this cycle of home life and didn't even realize she'd ever worked. Matthew's money was enough for them. And her husband was satisfied with the fact that after work he had a clean house, a hot dinner, fed and washed children, and a wife who did not smell of chlorine and iodine. Only now Marian did not understand what she should do in this situation. She hasn't worked in 7 years. They live in a flat that still has a mortgage to pay for a few more years. The money they have now is only enough for a month at the most. If they cut back on all their expenses, 2 months. Of course, there was hope that Matthew would come to his senses and call. But her gut feeling told her that wasn't going to happen. And then what to do? Where do I get the money? Marian had no one to help her. She didn't know her father, her mother never told her much about him. And her mom had died 5 years ago. We've got to get a job, thought Marian. Otherwise, we'll soon be on the street. The woman who sat across from her took another look at her CV and sighed heavily. She lowered her heavy metal-rimmed glasses closer to the tip of her nose. It was getting towards evening, and the employment officer wanted to finish the day and go home as soon as possible. And here was this misunderstanding, a 35-year-old mother of 3 minor children who had last worked 7 years ago as a nurse in a regular hospital. I don't know what to offer you, she said. I don't suppose you'd consider per diem or full-time work at all? Marian sighed and waved her hands. The woman snorted unhappily. Then I have nothing to offer you. Nothing at all? Marian clarified. No. Noticing the disappointed look on Marian's face, the woman said. "I still have your phone number, and if anything comes up, I'll call you." "Thank you," Marion replied, smiled, and walked out, carefully closing the door behind her. Already outside, when she got into her old black Toyota, which she had bought before her marriage, Marion exhaled slowly and leaned back in the driver's seat. "It's okay," she said to herself. "We'll make it." She mentally counted the money she had left there should be enough for another month. She had already cut back on her own expenses, but she didn't want to save money on the children. Though if she couldn't find a job, she'd have to cut back on their clubs and activities. She could also sell some of her things, especially expensive clothes or shoes. Marion didn't have any, but it would be possible to take the jewelry, laptop, and maybe the TV from the bedroom to a pawn shop for appraisal. All the jewelry, TVs, laptop, and even Marion's new winter boots that Matthew had given her last New Year's Eve had already been sold. They were very nice, but uncomfortable, and she'd hardly ever worn them. Then she remembered and decided to check how much they were worth. Turned out to be a fortune. Marion dropped the price by a quarter, and within a couple of hours, some happy woman took them. "I spent 6 months looking for them in all the shops," she told Marion. "Now all my girlfriends will be jealous of me." When she had gone, Marion breathed a sigh of relief. They could last another fortnight. What then? She had already cut every expense she could. There was nothing left to sell. Would she really have to settle for full-time work? What about the kids? Leave them alone from morning till night. Of course, Stephen's 14, Alex is 10, and Molly's 7. They're not toddlers. And the eldest has been telling his mother for a long time that he can handle the younger ones if she has to feed them, pick them up from school, make them do their homework. But does she have the right to put the responsibilities of adulthood on her boy's shoulders so early? The sound of the phone suddenly ringing almost made Marion jump. She wasn't expecting a call, and the number was unfamiliar. Normally she tried not to take such calls, but suddenly she thought that she was about to be told something good, because she was tired of bad news. "I'm listening," she said cautiously into the receiver, dreading the thought that she was about to be offered some kind of credit or told a story about a suspicious transaction on her card. But the pleasant female voice on the other end said something else. "Marion, my name is Amanda. I got your number from the unemployment office. Are you still considering a job offer?" "Yes," Marion shouted hastily, and then, ashamed of her impulsiveness, added more calmly, "I'm still considering it." "Good." Amanda seemed genuinely pleased. "It says here that you've been a nurse for many years. You also have experience with critically ill patients." "That's right," Marion replied. "I would like to ask you if you would consider a job as a carer." Marion thought for a moment. She had never worked as a carer, but it was hardly more difficult than a nurse's job. If she'd ever handled an entire ward, she could certainly handle one seriously ill person. "I can think about your offer," she said cautiously, "but I'd have to know all the conditions." "I'll be sure to tell you everything," Amanda promised. "Would it be convenient for you to come to my office at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning?" "Yes, of course." "Great. Then I'll text you the address. I'll see you tomorrow." "Goodbye," Marion replied and pressed the end button. Her heart was pounding frantically for some reason. No, of course it was too early to rejoice, but at least one sentence had come to life again, and hope had been rekindled in her. After taking the children to school, Marion drove to her appointment. On the way, she once again ran through her mind the answers to all the questions she thought she might be asked. She also wrote out in notes on her phone what she wanted to find out for herself. Amanda's office was located right in the center of the city, a huge, modern business center. When Marion stepped into the new, shiny, almost silent lift, she thought that Amanda must be working for some very wealthy people. "Good afternoon," she was greeted in the reception area by a pretty young girl. "Amanda's secretary, I think. My name is Vivienne." "I have an interview here at 10 o'clock, Marion informed her. "For the position of a carer," she said sympathetically or surprisingly, but she pulled herself together and smiled politely. "Please have a seat. I will clarify everything now." Marion sat down, and the secretary rang the telephone and asked something quietly and quickly into the receiver. The answer was apparently in the affirmative. Then Vivian stood up, smiled once more at Marion, and said, "Amanda is expecting you. Come in." Marion was escorted to the door like royalty. For a second she was even frightened. A place like this wouldn't treat a mere nurse like that. Maybe she was confused. "Hello," Marion said timidly as she entered the office. Amanda appeared to be a pretty woman about her age. Black hair, gathered in a neat low ponytail, business suit, expensive glasses. "Good afternoon, Marion," she said. "Please have a seat." She pointed with her hand to a cushioned armchair directly across from her. Marion sat down. Amanda smiled and clicked on the clipboard lying on the desk in front of her. "According to our information, you have extensive experience as a nurse, including you indicated that you've cared for critically ill patients?" Marion nodded. "And you are also considering a position as a carer. Is that correct?" "That's correct," Marion confirmed. "Good. I'm representing a client who needs a carer. Mr. Jacob has been paralyzed from the waist down for a number of years, and he has several other cardiovascular, respiratory, and digestive problems." Marion nodded again, showing she was listening intently. "From a physical point of view, your job would not be considered hard," Amanda continued. "The whole house is equipped for Mr. Jacob's needs. Motorized wheelchairs, lifts, handrails, and so on. There'll be no complicated medical procedures, either shots, pills, IVs, etc. Nothing a nurse couldn't master, I realized." "Right," Marion said. Amanda paused, as if considering how best to present the next piece of information. Then she pressed her lip, as if she'd changed her mind about what she was going to say, and asked, "I believe you have children?" "Yes," Marion nodded. "3. Amanda nodded thoughtfully. "They're all in school, aren't they?" "Yes." "So they'll be on holiday soon?" "Yes, in a couple of weeks." "Are you considering accommodation?" Amanda asked. "Our client's house is out of town, and it would be inconvenient for you to go there every day." Marion shook her head. "I don't have anyone to leave my children with," she said, frustrated and thinking she was going to be told goodbye. But suddenly Amanda spoke up. "You don't have to leave them. You will live with them together in the grounds of the manor in the annex. To be exact, it's a detached building, very spacious, very cozy. I assure you, you'll like it." Marion looked at her incredulously. "Are you saying that the 4 of us will just be allowed to live in a tenant's house?" Amanda nodded and smiled happily. "What's more, you won't even have to cook. The meals are free, as is the accommodation. You will be fed with the rest of the staff of the manor." "Sounds tempting," Marion said cautiously. "I'm beginning to suspect there's a catch." "Exactly," Amanda confirmed cheerfully. "I suppose you'd like to know the hours and wages?" "I would," said Marion cautiously. Amanda nodded. Her neatly manicured fingers ran across the screen of the tablet. She turned it toward Marion. Marion's eyes widened. "This is for the week," Amanda explained. "A week?" Marion was even more surprised. "That much money?" Amanda sighed a little too humanly, which was very unlike her image of an impeccable business assistant. "I realize you're expecting a catch." "And there is," she said. Marion pressed her lips together, nodded slowly, and looked questioningly at Amanda. She rubbed the bridge of her nose tiredly. "The thing is, Mr. Jacob is a very particular man, and he has a difficult temper. Not everyone can get along with him." Marion breathed out a sigh of relief. "That's it? I've seen all sorts of people in my years at the hospital, and we've never been paid so much for being unhealthy." "That's not quite all," Amanda shook her head. "I can't promise you'll have a steady schedule. Roughly speaking, if Mr. Jacob thought of calling you in at 2 a.m., that would mean you'd have to get up and show up." "But everything you've said so far is true, isn't it?" Marion asked. "Yes, the salary that I wrote you is paid once a week, because the staff doesn't usually stay there for a long time," Amanda answered. "You and the children will live in a separate building and eat at the employer's expense. If you or the children need to go into town, we will provide you with a car and driver. And in return, I have to look after an elderly, capricious millionaire, and be ready to appear at his beck and call at any moment. You could say that Amanda nodded. "I am ready," said Marion. "When can we start?" It took them a while to complete the paperwork. Then Marion waited until the children were on holiday. Finally, they packed all the necessary things and drove to the manor to the mysterious Jacob. "Are you sure he's not some kind of freak?" Alex asked her. "We're all going to his place. We don't know where to go." Marion blushed. They were traveling in a car with a driver sent directly by her employer. She looked in the mirror and saw that the driver, who introduced himself as Marcus, was smiling. "Alex, we're not going somewhere. We're going to an upmarket village," Marion said indignantly. "Jacob is normal, please, nothing extra. If you have to meet Jacob, you realize how important this job is to me." "Jacob will probably only get to know you," Marcus said. "He doesn't like new people very much, and he wanted me to bring you straight to the outhouse." "I see," replied Marion. A short time later, they entered the village. "Wow," Alex commented. "If there are crazy people living here, they are very rich." Stephen laughed, and Molly nearly broke the glass she had pressed her forehead against to get a good look. "Yes," thought Marion, "there are some very rich people living here." They drove past huge mansions surrounded by large fences. "That's nothing," Marcus said cheerfully. "You haven't seen Jacob's main house yet." "The next one will be more interesting," Marcus said. After they had driven through the village, there was a large area surrounded by a beautiful, elegant, but very high fence. The driver pressed some button on a small black remote control that appeared in his hand, and the gate opened. "We are now entering the grounds of the manor," Marcus commented. They drove for a long time along the road, which was surrounded on both sides by rows of neatly trimmed trees. Then a huge modern house, made of glass and metal, appeared in front of them. But the car did not go towards the mansion, but turned left. A few minutes later, they stopped in front of a small, neat wooden house. Marion and the children got out of the car. "It's beautiful," said Marion. "This outhouse must be very old." Marcus, who had also got out of the car and was already taking their suitcases out of the boot, replied. "Yes, it was built more than half a century ago. But don't worry. The outbuilding was restored only recently, about 2 years ago. There's water, electricity, everything." "It looks like something out of a 19th century novel," said Stephen. "That's right," the driver replied, coming up to the porch with his suitcases in his hands. "I don't know exactly, but I think that was the idea." When they went inside, Marion noticed that, despite the seeming compactness of the outbuilding, it was very spacious inside. There was a small entrance hall, which almost immediately led into a living room, apparently connected to the kitchen dining room. A spacious in-suite bathroom, and, most importantly, 4 bedrooms. "Wow," Alex shrieked. "Am I going to have a separate bedroom?" Marion smiled. "Apparently, yes. In the old flat, the brothers had shared a room, and only Molly had her own bedroom." Stephen looked at his mother and smiled. "He's all grown up now, isn't he?" Suddenly, Marion thought that he needed his own room for a long time. Meanwhile, Marcus had already brought in all their things and said, "Make yourselves comfortable, have a rest. I think in about an hour they'll be here to take you to lunch. You'll get to know everyone there." "Thank you, Marcus," Marion said sincerely. He smiled. "It was nice to meet you all. I hope you enjoy your time here and stick around." In the hour they had, everyone had time to put their things away and settle into their new place of residence a little. Alex and Molly even ran around the outhouse. There they found a gazebo, a swing, and some well-tended flower beds. "Mummy, I love it here," Molly exclaimed, running up to Marion and hugging her legs. Marion smiled and stroked her daughter's hair. "I'm very glad," she said. "I hope you won't be bored here." "Not while you're working," the younger one said confidently. At that moment, there was a knock at the door. "Yes, come in," Marion answered. A tall, blonde-haired man with brown eyes walked into the cabin. He was dressed simply in a white t-shirt and black jeans, but he held himself so freely and confidently that Marion immediately realized that this man plays not the least role here. "Good afternoon, everyone." The first thing the stranger said was, "Hello. My name is Robert. I'm Jacob's assistant and the manager of this house." "Nice to meet you," she said. "My name is Marion, and these are my children, Steve and Alex and Molly." "Hello," they said in unison. Robert smiled. "It's a pleasure. I'm sure you will revitalize our sleepy kingdom. Now I invite you all to lunch." He led them down an inconspicuous path that led to the side entrance of the mansion. Through this door, they passed into a large and cozy kitchen. "Here are our newcomers." A woman's voice greeted them cheerfully. Marion saw a short, slightly overweight woman in her 50s. "I'm Camila," she said. "I am in charge of the food in this house. Come to the table." Marion introduced herself and the children, and they were seated at the table. There were about 10 other people besides them. They were all employees of the manor. They introduced themselves to Marion, but she was so nervous that she couldn't really remember anyone, just smiled and nodded. At Marion's right hand sat Robert. "Don't worry," he whispered in her ear. "You'll remember everyone in a couple of days." "How do you know what I was thinking?" Marion asked. "It's not difficult," replied Robert. "When I came to work here and everyone was introduced to me, I thought the same thing." Marion grinned. Her first fear had receded. Everyone seemed to be very nice and friendly here. Also, the kids were very well behaved after they ate lunch. Robert took Marion to meet the supervisor, and Marcus volunteered to give the children a tour of the estate. When Robert and Marion stopped in front of the office door, her employer's assistant began to speak softly, looked her in the eye, and said, "Marion, remember the most important thing: any comments Jacob will let slip about you have nothing to do with you personally. He is just an old, sick man with a hard fate and a very bad temper. In fact, that's why we're willing to give you such a great salary and facilities." "Thank you for telling me, Robert. But don't worry, I'm tougher than I look." "I'm sure you are." Then he knocked and opened the door. At last came a creaky, aged voice. "I thought I was going to die in here before any of you bothered to come in. I wonder why I pay you, all you bums, so much money." In a chair by the window sat an old, hunched old man. Marion thought that this was the kind of man they drew in books when they described an orphan protagonist who lived with an evil old relative. It was obvious that Jacob used to be a tall, sturdy man. Though the years had dried him up and pulled his head to the ground, his shoulders were still broad and even a little proud. Short gray hair, wrinkled neck, stubble, long straight nose, tightly closed lips, and angry, prickly eyes. They must once have been blue or green, but now they had faded so much that it was impossible to tell, and with those eyes he studied Marion coldly. It was as if Marion was being scanned, checking what was inside her. "Is it this one?" Jacob asked Robert, ignoring her completely, as if Marion herself were incapable of answering him. "That's Marion," the assistant answered. "She will be your new nurse." "Hello," said Marion, deciding that she would not stand here waiting to be addressed. Jacob frowned as if he'd eaten something sour. "Yes," he said, "it gets worse every time. Come on, Robert, let's go see what we can do with her." The assistant smiled encouragingly at Marion and went out. Without Robert, Marion immediately felt somehow defenseless, but she was determined that she would not let her charge spoil her mood. She needed this job. She liked the bright, spacious outhouse they were put in. She liked being able to spend quality time with the children. She liked the fact that she didn't have to go anywhere, and she certainly wasn't going to be leaving here in a week. So Marion pulled herself together, smiled, and said, "Well, where do we start? How about a shave for starters? Otherwise you look very overgrown, not like a millionaire, but like a homeless man." Oh, why did I say that? She immediately thought in horror. I wanted to say something else about my skills, about what a highly skilled nurse I am. Now he's going to fire me for sure. Jacob raised his bushy gray eyebrows in surprise and suddenly laughed like a madman. "Like a homeless man, you say?" he said, when he could laugh. "Well, take me to the bathroom, if that's the case." "Where's your bathroom?" she asked. The old man rolled his eyes. Yeah, that's professionalism in all its glory, he grumbled. Then he pressed a button on the arm of the chair, and it went somewhere along the line. All she had to do was follow him. Jacob led her into a large, airy room. It took Marian a few seconds to explore the place and marveled at how conveniently everything was arranged. She found a cape, shaving foam, and a clipper. "Do you even know how to do that?" Jacob asked her doubtfully. "I do," Marian said calmly. The last time she had used a clipper had been a long time ago, when she was still working at the hospital. One of her patients had asked her to shave his neck before an operation. He couldn't do it himself, his hands were too shaky. "That's all right," thought Marian, "I can do it now." When she had finished, she looked with satisfaction at the result of her work. "There," she said, turning her ward to the mirror. "A different look." Jacob saw himself and gasped. "What have you done, you fool?" he shouted. "Couldn't you at least leave a few millimeters? Why cut everything to 0? You can see all my wrinkles and folds. I look like I'm about to die." Marian looked in the mirror, but decided not to show fear. "It's hygienic," she said sternly. "And it suits you better, believe me, as a woman." The old man chuckled. "Any man has ever been a woman." Marian's face seemed to flush. Yes, she had come here in a simple dress, with her hair unsightly in a ponytail, but to take her for an old maid was too much. "Don't worry," she said dryly. "I have 3 children." Jacob whistled. "And from different men, too." "One," Marian said wryly. "But he's an interesting guy, having 3 kids and a woman to work with." Marian pressed her lips together. "We broke up." "Why are you panting like that? Did you run away?" "That's none of your business," she said more sharply than she intended. "What's next on the plan?" "Snake, get the clipboard from the table," the old man grumbled. Marian should have left a detailed schedule there. The tablet was found in the indicated place. Marian ran her eyes over it. Yes, there's a lot to do. It seems that Jacob is indeed seriously ill, at least judging by the number of pills and shots he gets every day. "Have you had lunch yet?" she clarified. "No, I was waiting for you." "Of course I've had lunch, I see." Marian decided not to react to the abruptness. "Then you have rest and IVs now," she said. "You're a genius." Jacob pulled the tablet down so his fingers shared the screen but said nothing. "Are we going to drip lying down or standing up?" How many more stupid questions are there going to be today, Marian thought. Marian, hardly gritting her teeth, answered, "There will be questions until I fully understand your regimen and appointments. For your information, some patients prefer to sit during the procedure. I'm thrilled for them. We're laying on you," she continued, ignoring the sarcastic tone, "which means there should be a couch." Marian began to look round. The old man sighed and nodded his head. "There's a door over there that leads to the treatment room." The IV went relatively quietly, too. Marian was afraid she wouldn't get into a vein the first time after all. It had been years since she'd injected. But today she was lucky. Jacob even closed his eyes and dozed off. He woke up when she was pulling the needle out of his vein. "We're going for a walk now," Marian said. "Really?" said the old man. "I thought it was a tambourine dance." Marian wondered how she had so much patience. She was used to strangers being so rude and disrespectful to her, for just doing her job. Jacob hired her for this job, if you think about it. It's understandable that she wouldn't know anything on the first day. Can't she have a little self-restraint? Marian thought as she walked through the garden beside his chair. Why should he? He's a millionaire. He's not used to restraining himself. He must have had more than one carer before her. And if she fails or decides to leave, his team will find another one the same day. In the meantime, he can just take his anger out on people like they're his punching bags. During the walk, however, Jacob was a little quieter. It was as if he was immersed in his own memories, not paying attention to Marian, who was walking beside him. He just rolled along the paths, automatically switching buttons to turn in the right direction. He doesn't really need me right now, Marian thought. He can ride on his own. The paths are perfect everywhere. But according to the terms of the contract, I must accompany him at all times and never leave him alone. I wonder if you like that kind of work, Merlin, Jacob asked suddenly. I'm Marion, she corrected. I don't care. It's just a job, a normal job. He chuckled. You don't say. I have a lot of my own companies, employing thousands of people. If I wanted to, I could buy up all the houses in this village. That's a proper job. You can leave me at the bar, the old man continued through gritted teeth. If you stay, you'll do a lot of other, less pleasant things. Isn't that what you dreamed of at school? Marion felt herself getting really angry. I don't know why you started this conversation, she said honestly. Jacob grinned. Aren't you ashamed of yourself in front of the kids? You're a grown woman working as a nurse. You don't even have to be smart about it. Just do as you're told. A monkey could do it. Or is that all you're not clever enough to do? If the monkey could do it, why do you change carers so often? Marion asked. Maybe it's because you don't treat them like people, but like animals. I think I'd agree that chimpanzees or gorillas would be a better fit. At least they wouldn't understand how you treat them. The old man laughed. I'm a millionaire. Manners don't suit you, princess. You can leave even today. I'll even ask Robert to pay you a week's salary in advance. For a second, Marion wanted to take the money, grab the children, leave and never see this arrogant, nasty old man who treats her like some baron with servants. No, she said to herself, that's what he wants, and I'll never get another job like that. Marion remembered how many CVS she'd sent, how many times she'd been rejected, how many evenings she'd sat thinking about what else she could sell to pay the mortgage and food. I'm fine with it, she said cheerfully to Jacob, and even found the strength to smile. We've got dinner and evening treatments coming up, so I think you should turn your vehicle in the opposite direction. Marion had been working for Jacob for a fortnight now, and every day she felt like she couldn't hate the man more. And every new day he proved her otherwise. The old man always found something to pick on about Marion: her appearance, her voice, her gait, words spoken with the wrong accent. Once she got overexcited and didn't get into his vein the first time. He remembered it for 3 days. Marion was shaking with unfair resentment, anger, and most of all, powerlessness. She realized that Jacob was aware of her predicament and was taking advantage of it. He was used to power, used to being first in everything, to being obeyed, to being feared. And now he is just a pathetic, sick grandfather who is left all alone. Having plucked up courage, Marion once asked Robert if their boss had a wife and children. As far as I know, he replied, no children, but he had 4 wives. 4? Marion gasped. Yep, the first one he married when he was very young. I think she was from a rich family. Did he work for her father then, or did they have a business together? I don't know exactly. It was kind of a marriage of convenience. Jacob worked hard. His father-in-law noticed him and helped him start his own business. When the boss got big enough, he didn't need his wife, so he filed for divorce. Then there was some model about 10 or 15 years younger than him, Robert continued. They lived with her for a while, 3 or 4 years. Then he caught her cheating on him and divorced her too. And the third, as far as I know, left him. She was also some young and beautiful girl who got bored with him. Gee, sighed Marion. And the fourth was already some old friend of his. They were the same age and had been friends for a long time. They'd married when they were both in their 50s. Both he and she had a few divorces under their belts. She was the one they seemed to have a good life with. But she died about 5 years ago of cancer. Oh, that sounds sad, said Marion. People who've been here longer than me say that's when he got the way he is now. He was supposedly quite tolerable before. No angel, of course, but he could live. Now he's getting worse every day. Marion sighed. That's a very sad way of putting it. Doesn't he have any relatives? Robert shrugged. There seems to be a sister who has children and grandchildren of her own, but they live abroad and rarely come here. He's a very lonely man, said Marion. It's sad to be so ill, living alone in a huge house. Aha, replied the steward. So he takes out his poison on those around him. Every evening, Marian looked forward to the end of the working day. Then she could finally live for herself, spend time with her children. They had settled in quite well, by the way. All the staff were very friendly to Stephen, Alex, and especially little Molly. Camila took care of them, feeding them goodies. Marcus, with Marian's permission, took the children for rides with him if he went somewhere not far away on the chief's errands. The boys had mastered the grounds of the manor with its huge garden and many beautiful quiet corners. The only thing they tried to do was to keep out of sight of the master of the house. It wasn't that hard, though. Jacob only went for walks when Marian was with him. It was usually in the morning, and only sometimes in the afternoon or late afternoon. A fortnight later, Marian was reminded for the first time that she had an irregular working day. She and the children had long since gone to bed when Marian's phone suddenly rang. Robert's number came up. "Yes, I'm listening," Marian mumbled sleepily. "Marian, get in the house right away. Jacob's having a seizure." Marian jumped up on the bed. She was wide awake. She had been warned that the ward could have such attacks. In such a case, Marian should immediately run into the house and administer first aid. She didn't even bother to get dressed, just threw on a dressing gown over her nightgown and rushed into the house. The lights were already on everywhere, and frightened night maids and guards were running around. Marian made her way to the bedroom without wasting time. Jacob was half lying on the bed, breathing so heavily that she could hear him whistling and wheezing from a distance. Beside him stood Robert, who had put the supervisor in, opened the windows, now pulling out anything Marian might need. She nodded gratefully to the manager and set to work. She put the oxygen mask on Jacob's blue face and started the oxygen supply. Then she quickly found the vials in the medicine cabinet, filled the syringes, and administered the injections. Fortunately, the attack was not severe, and the medicine began to take effect quickly. Marian watched carefully as the old man's pulse evened out, his breathing recovered, and his complexion returned to normal. "There," she said. "It's all right, Jacob." The old man nodded and gave a hoarse squeeze. "For someone who's just been hoofing it, that'll do." "You should have some hot tea with mint or linden now," Marian said. "I'll have them make it for you." "Yes," said the chief. "And I have one more favor to ask of you. Will you do it?" Marian nodded. "Yes, of course. What is it?" "Next time move faster, or you'll be dead before you get there." Marian felt all her pity, which she had just felt, watching the old man suffering a seizure, as if blown away by the wind. "I'll do my best," she replied discreetly. "I'll go and tell him about the tea." A minute after Marian had asked for tea to be made, Robert came into the kitchen. "How are you?" he asked. "All right." "That's just the way he is. He'll play the villain to the last, even when he's dying." Marian asked. "I think that's what he is." The steward sighed and ran his hand through his hair. "You know," he said in a confidential tone, "I sometimes think that the chief isn't really like that. It's just that at some point he's decided that this is the only way to communicate with the world, and he's afraid to act human." Marian shrugged her shoulders. "A noble theory, Robert, but I'm sorry, I'm sure he's being sincere." Robert smiled. "How about some coffee?" he suggested. "No, I'd rather go to bed." "Good night." "Good night, Marian." The next day, when Marian and the children came for breakfast, Robert made an unexpected announcement. "Marian, you have the day off today." "Why is that?" she wondered. The manager shrugged his shoulders. "The chief said so. His sister and her children are visiting him. Apparently they'll look after him." Marian frowned. "And the injections? IVs?" Robert waved his hand. "Don't worry, we call a nurse from the private clinic for such cases." "Why doesn't she come every day? Why should I?" Marian didn't understand. "The boss doesn't like new people." Camila suddenly intervened in their conversation with a smile. "He was just putting the children on the second portion of pancakes, so he demands that there should be one constant. Someone who knows all his habits." "I see," Marian replied. That's why he drives people crazy and makes them quit, she added mentally. And it's more pleasant to abuse a permanent slave than nurses from a private clinic who will be different every time. But she didn't want to say it out loud in front of the kids. Let them think she had a good job. We've almost all got the day off, Marcus added. If you don't mind, Marion and you guys too. I can take the kids to the zoo and then we can go out for lunch on the way, Marcus said. Yes, Uncle Marcus, Molly shouted happily. Of the three, she was most attached to the young, cheerful driver, who always paid attention to the children. No, my good ones, Robert said firmly. Marcus has the day off and I can't force you on him. The driver waved his hand. Don't worry, Robert, he said. I'm going there with my nephew anyway. He's 10, and I'll take yours with me. 2, it won't be a problem. Marian looked at the children doubtfully. We'll behave, Alex said, looking at his mother pleadingly. The eldest shrugged his shoulders, saying that if necessary he would go. Marian never worried about his behavior. All right, she sighed. Then I'll go get the money. No need, Marcus replied. The chief always leaves money for such small expenses. The others present nodded. Don't even worry about it, Camila assured her. After breakfast, Marcus and the children went to the garage to start the car and drive to the zoo. Robert and Marian were the only ones left. Do you have plans for the day off? The assistant asked Marian. I don't know. I should probably go into town, see how the flat is. Robert perked up. Do you want to go for a ride together? I've got a couple of chief cases to take care of. It won't take long, and then we can see your flat. And we can have lunch on the way back if you don't mind. Yes, that's all right, said Marian. Robert was easy and comfortable with her. He could keep up a conversation without being intrusive. He talked interestingly about the things he was doing now, but did not spill too much. Marian suddenly realized how little she had ever had such simple human companionship in her life. After she quit her job, all she had left in her life was her husband and children. Sure, there were her friends from college and work, but they had their own lives, husbands, kids, jobs. And they didn't get to see each other very often. And after Matthew left, she'd lost herself. Constant thoughts of how to find a job, how to pay the rent, worrying about how her children would feel about their father leaving. There was no time for herself. How long have you been working for Jacob? She asked Robert. He thought for a few seconds. 5 years. That's a long time. Well, if you don't count me, I'm hardly the newest guy in the house. Wow, how you're all holding up. Is there a secret, or was the manager not like this before? The manager laughed. When I came, he was perhaps a little gentler, but he wasn't particularly kind. I won't hide it. He's not easy for me either. I can imagine, said Marian, sighing. Robert smiled. For the first 6 months, I wanted to quit, probably 7 times a day, then a little less often. Now I don't think about it at all. Why not? Marian frowned. Salary, of course, it plays its part too. Not the last, but not the first. What else? Marian wondered. Robert is so clever, so confident. He must be a good professional and, unlike her, could find many more excellent jobs. Experience, Robert said. I not only run the house, but I help Jacob run his business remotely. Don't look so weak and decrepit. He's got a pretty good head. Marian wasn't sure, but she decided not to argue. And now I'm unlikely to find another job where I can watch how to manage such a huge amount of money, the assistant continued. Understand? I do, said Marian, except that your life keeps revolving around Jacob. Don't you feel sorry for yourself? Your wife and children hardly ever see you at home? Robert laughed. I guess I don't look very young, he replied. But I'm only 33. Marian was confused. I don't know what you mean, she admitted. And you look wonderful. Thank you. May. I'm flattered. It's not every day I get compliments from such beautiful young women, Robert said. I mean, I don't have a wife or children yet. A fiancé? Marian asked. No, no girlfriend. I see that looks suspicious, laughed Marian. A little, Robert admitted. I'm just a workaholic. I want to start a family when I'm sure I can provide for them. By the way, we're here. It'll be 15 minutes in the rain. Then we'll see your flat. Of course, Marian replied. Robert took some folder with documents and went out. Marian was left alone in the car. She suddenly thought that perhaps, like Robert, she would be tied to this house and the mean old man for years to come. Okay, it's summer now. What about in the autumn when the kids go to school, she pondered. Marian suddenly realized that Amanda, who had hired her, hadn't talked to her about the matter, most likely because she hadn't counted on Marian holding out this long. And Marian has, and she's not going to quit. No, Jacob can't wait, she thought, biting her lip painfully, remembering last night. She'd been truly afraid for him then, and for the first time since then, sorry. As soon as he could breathe, he'd snapped at her. Robert came back and interrupted her sad thoughts. He looked pleased. What? Let's go to your place, he asked. Let's go. Marian replied. Everything was fine in her flat, too. It was as unlikely as anything could happen, but Marian was still more used to being in control. Lunch now. Robert said cheerfully, I'll show you a lovely place. But I don't think they cook as well as our Camilla does. Oh yes, sighed Marian. Nothing can compare to her food. But I'll try to surprise you. Robert took her to a large Georgian restaurant on the top floor of a large shopping center. There was pleasant national music playing. The air conditioners were running at full blast, which was especially nice after a hot summer day. They were escorted to a table with 2 soft sofas right by the window. From there they had a view of the river and the new high bridge. Would you mind if I chose for you? Robert asked. Go ahead, Marian replied cheerfully. I don't know anything here anyway. Fine, Robert replied. When the waiter came, Robert pointed his finger at several items on the menu without showing Marian. So she didn't know what to expect. She was surprised when the first thing she got was a glass of red wine. It's only lunchtime, she reminded her companion. So, Robert asked. Marian sighed because she couldn't find any other arguments. Aren't you going to have any? She inquired. I'm driving. Definitely not, Robert replied. The wine was both moderately sweet and tart. Marian savored the taste and suddenly thought she couldn't remember the last time she had sat like this and spent time quietly with a glass of wine. Thank you, she said. This is the most wonderful weekend I've ever had. Robert smiled. Wait to thank you, he said. The food hasn't arrived yet. Marian liked the food very much. The soft, hot dough of the khachapuri with the slightly difficult-to-stretch cheese, the salad with crisp mini aubergines and lots of greens, the flavorful meat, and the juicy sauces. Oh, she said, leaning back on the soft back of the couch. That was wonderful. I'm very glad, Robert replied. He was leaning back and apparently unable to move either. It seems that it will take us some time to recover, Robert remarked. Marian nodded lazily and took a sip of wine. I fully support it, she said. In the meantime, we can talk. Robert raised his eyebrows in surprise. That sounds scary, he said. Marian laughed. I'm not your wife to make it sound scary. Not yet. Anyway, I'm listening. Marian laughed. For some reason, she felt very light and good. Tell me about yourself, she asked, and then confessed, you're a mystery to me. That's quite a confession, Robert grinned. Why is that? I wondered. I just don't know anything about you, said Marian. Neither do you about me, Robert remarked. Fair enough. But let's start with you, Marian suggested. Robert chuckled. Well, let's. I'm not from around here, he began. I was born in a small town far, far away from here. Yes, I went to an ordinary village school. Lived in an ordinary family, but always had great ambition. Marian smiled. So Robert continued. I decided to come here. It wasn't easy, but I managed. The student years were fun. Then I got a job second, third, fourth. Then I got to Jacob. Do you know the rest of it? I have a feeling you've left a lot out of your story, Marion said thoughtfully. Who knows, maybe I'll tell you about it later, Robert said. Now we need to talk about you. Good. But I haven't got anything interesting either, admitted Marion. I'm a local, but only my mom raised me. I never met my father, and my mom never told me much about him. She was a music teacher. So as you know, we didn't live very well. Did you go to music school? Robert asked. Marion sighed. It was a terrible 7 years of my life, she said. I can only remember one tune now. Mom made me play it most often. Everything else has faded from my memory. I've played this one so many times that if you woke me up at 2 a.m., I could play it with my eyes closed. What's the tune? Bach, Chopin, Tchaikovsky? Robert asked. No, it's not classical for sure, replied Marion. Honestly, I don't even know. Mom never told me who the author was. We certainly didn't study it at school. I have a theory that she composed it herself, but I can't say it's true. Well, go on, said Robert, and then he interrupted himself. Do any of your children go to music school? No one, Marion cut him off. Robert laughed. Shall I order you some more wine? She shrugged, and Robert asked for another glass. Unlike you, I didn't do very well at school, she continued. The only thing I could count on after high school was college. And for some reason I suddenly decided I wanted to be a nurse. I thought it was a very beautiful, noble, and romantic profession, said Marion. It is, Robert agreed. Not a bit of it. Marion sighed. No, I don't regret it. Studying was interesting and so was working. It was at work that I met Matthew, my husband. He was a patient of yours. Yeah, I'd just started working. I didn't really know how to do anything on my own. I remember my hands shaking when I was giving injections or dressings. I thought I could see it from a mile away. But Matthew didn't notice. Robert smiled. I'm sure he fell in love with you at first sight. He said he did. Marion nodded. In fact, I liked him too. Soon we started seeing each other, and 6 months later we were married. And then I found out I was pregnant. You've become a very young mum, Robert smiled. Yes, of course it was difficult at first. But then Mum was still alive and she helped me a lot, said Marion and sighed. Then Stephen grew up and went to kindergarten. I went to work, but not for long. When he turned 4, I got pregnant with Alex. And 3 years later, Molly was born. Wow. After Molly was born, we decided I was going to stay at home. That's why I didn't work for 7 years. Wow, Robert said. I must say you're doing a wonderful job, especially after such a break. Marion smiled. Thank you. That's nice to hear. Can I ask you a personal question? Ask away, she nodded to Robert. Marion took another sip of wine. Why did you separate from your husband? Robert asked. Why did I leave my husband? She asked him again. Yes, he left me. Maybe the wine played a part. Maybe it's been a while, but it's the first time I've ever made that confession so easily. He just left a note saying he was in love with another woman, she explained. He didn't even talk to you, Robert wondered. Marion shook her head. What about the children? He didn't even say goodbye to them either? How awful, Robert exclaimed. Marion smiled. I don't know what you mean. What horror. It's all right, she said. I'm fine now. Is that why you're holding on to this job? Robert guessed. Exactly, Marion nodded. They were silent for a few minutes. Each was digesting everything that had been said in the dialogue. Then Marion asked, What about your personal life? You're only 2 years younger than me. I can't believe you haven't had a serious relationship. Robert smiled kind of sadly. I have, and for quite a long time. I started dating an ambitious girl when I was still in college. I had that quality too. Only our goals were different. My ambitions were career-related, and hers were to find a successful man. Aren't you a successful man? Marion asked in surprise. Thank you for saying that. It's hard for me to judge that myself. Then I tell you that you are a successful man, interrupted Marion. Much obliged, Robert replied. Well, anyway, my beloved did not consider me a successful man, and she broke up with me because she said she was worthy of more. A very stupid woman, commented Marion. After that statement, I'm obliged to pour you more wine, Robert said, indicating to the waiter to repeat himself. Oh, sighed Marion, I haven't drunk so much in a long time. So Robert continued. She left me, and I decided that I would become the successful one, and she would come back to me. And how did it go? Marion asked. Great. In the process, I realized that I don't want to be with a woman for whom I'm not good enough, for whom I'm important not as a person but as a social status. Marion nodded. And I don't want to be with a man who gave birth to 3 children. And then he left, leaving only a note on the table, she confessed. Robert smiled sadly. I fully support such a wise decision. In the morning, Marion woke up with difficulty. Her head ached and her mouth was dry. The light of the sun shining through the curtains seemed unbearably bright. I overslept, she thought with horror. And I probably didn't even set my alarm clock last night. The clock, however, showed it was still early. Marion showered, brushed her teeth. After making sure the children were still asleep, she slipped quietly out of the outhouse and into the house. Camila was already bustling about in the kitchen. Oh, Marion. The woman greeted her cheerfully. Good morning. How are you up early this morning? Yes, said Marion hoarsely. It seems I had a very stormy day off yesterday. Camila smiled understandingly. Now everything will be. In an hour you will be awake and cheerful, like a 15-year-old schoolgirl. A minute later she put a huge cup of fragrant tea in front of Marion, smelling of berries and herbs. The best cure for a hangover, said Camila confidently. And eat this too. She set down a plate with a large sandwich with meat, lettuce, tomato and egg. This is the most delicious thing I've ever eaten in my life, Marion said blissfully as she ate her breakfast. You're magic. Thank you, Camila replied, embarrassed. By the beginning of the working day, Marion had recovered enough. Jacob had been unusually friendly today. Perhaps it was the meeting with his relatives, but he hardly commented on Marion's actions and did not make any derogatory comments. You're remarkably quiet today, said Marion, as they went out for their traditional afternoon walk after lunch. Don't let it get to you while it's quiet, Jacob said, but not in a mean-spirited way. All right, I won't, Marion said. Those are your children, aren't they? He pointed to Alex and Molly, who were chasing each other around the fountain. Stephen was sitting on a bench, reading a book with one eye and watching the younger ones with the other. Mine, replied Marion, horrified at the thought that she was about to be reprimanded, but her ward only nodded. They're good, and they seem to be friendly. Thank you, Marion replied cautiously. Are you raising them alone? Continued to show unexpected interest, Chief. I am now. That's why you put up with me, Jacob said, realizing it was a statement, not a question. I wanted to have many children when I was young, too, Jacob said suddenly. It didn't work out. You've been married 4 times, haven't you? Marion asked in surprise, and then a twinge. It was hardly appropriate to know such information. But strangely enough, the chief did not comment on it. Yes, he replied. Jacob stared ahead, as if he were mentally reviewing his whole life. Didn't your first wife want children? Marion asked. Yes, I didn't at the time, either, Jacob answered. She and I were young and spoiled. Both of us from rich families wanted to have fun and enjoy life. Or rather, my wife did. I was interested in building a business at the time. So why did you get married? My parents insisted. It was good for the business. Actually, I didn't mind. She was a pretty girl. I thought I'd get used to her. Well, after a few years, it became clear that we were completely different people. I got divorced and went to work. He stopped talking. "Can I have some water, please?" Jacob asked suddenly. Marian hurriedly held out the bottle. "Please," she thought, wondering for the first time in weeks what was happening to him. Jacob sipped and continued. "I don't have much to say about my second, third wives. I married them, I don't know, just for status. Young, beautiful. I thought it would be great, but every time I realized quickly that it wasn't what I wanted. And all they wanted from me was money." He fell silent again. Marian held out the water, but the old man shook his head negatively. Then there was another situation. This is what could have been true love. "Your fourth wife?" Marian asked. "No, that was before her. I didn't marry that girl. It was a waste, as I thought many times afterwards, but I don't want to talk about it. It's too personal." "And what he's telling me now isn't too personal," thought Marian, but yet for some reason he chose to share it with her. "The fourth wife became more of a friend to me," Jacob said. "I already knew about her diagnosis when I proposed marriage." "Diagnosis?" Marian asked. "Yes, Samantha had cancer. In fact, she and I had known each other for years, too. Our parents had been friends since childhood. Over the years, we'd kept in touch from time to time, and then suddenly we met and talked and decided that we could spend a few years together." "Were you with her all the way to the end?" Marian asked. The man nodded. "She was a wonderful woman and a true friend. After she died, I didn't need anyone else," Jacob said. "I sympathize with you," she said sincerely. It was as if Jacob woke up. "You and I have been talking," he said. "Come on, let's go home. It's time for my evening pills." After this strange conversation, Marian felt sorry for her ward again. It couldn't be said that their communication improved much after that. Jacob could still speak harshly to her, but now she somehow took it easier. Summer was coming to an end, and Marian wondered what to do when the children went to school. "How do you like it here?" she asked them one day. "I like it very much, ahead of the rest of them," Molly replied. "Aunt Amanda cooks good food. Uncle Marcus takes us everywhere. There's a big garden, so we can play all day long." "You have to go back to school soon," she reminded her daughter, who wrinkled her nose funny. "I don't want to go to school," she said. Marian sighed and looked at her middle son. "I like it here too," Alex said. "But about school, I understand that, he smiled at Marian. "You have to go to it." "Thank God I understand you." "The answer is accepted," Marian said. She shifted her gaze to her eldest son. "I think you and I need to talk," Stephen said. "Come on," Marian agreed. They went out into the garden. Stephen sighed. "Summer's coming to an end," he said. "We all have to go to school soon. We have to think about what to do about accommodation." Marian smiled. "You've got a good eye for detail, as always." The son nodded. "Dad called me the other day," he admitted. Marian's eyes widened. "When a few days ago? Why didn't he call me?" "Afraid, I guess. But the official story is that he's very busy." "I see," sighed Marian. "What did he want?" "As I understand it, he wants to meet you, maybe to discuss the divorce, or, on the contrary, wants to make up." Marian laughed. "Reconcile? Well, maybe." Marian hesitated, but then decided to ask her son the question. "Do you want that to happen?" Stephen shook his head negatively. "I don't mind the younger ones seeing him if they want to. I'll see him too if I have to, but the rest is up to you." "He's your father," she said, "but I don't think I love him anymore, and I can't forgive him for what he did." "You don't have to forgive him. As for our school, maybe we should talk to Robert now. Will he think of something?" "I'll try. You're the smartest," she hugged her son. "Everything will be fine," he said. "Tell your father I'm ready to talk to him. Let him call. Don't be afraid." "I'll tell him," Stephen promised. A few days later, after Marian and Jacob had finished their morning routine, Robert came in. "Ready, Jacob?" The assistant asked. "Where can I go?" The chief replied calmly. "Let's go." "Are you coming too?" Robert turned the last word to Marion. She was surprised. "She is, of course," replied the ward calmly. "I have a lot of documents to sign and some personal meetings. You could be needed at any time to change nappies or wipe armpits. I have to have some dignity. What if I have an attack at night? I don't want to suffocate in front of my business partners." As they drove to the business center where Jacob was supposed to do business, the manager explained. "We don't know exactly how long this will take. You can sit in the restaurant. It's in the same building on the top floor. Just tell him to put it on Jacob's tab." "Okay," Marion replied. "If you need anything, Robert will call Jacob," added. At the restaurant, Marion ordered tea and tiramisu. She suddenly thought it was a great opportunity to meet Matthew. He was kind of in town. Marion didn't get out here very often, and there were things she needed to discuss with her husband. She called her husband, and he was willing to come over. "What a place you picked," he said as he sat down at the table. "You look like you've lost a little weight. But you haven't changed, just like you've lost a little weight. You look amazing," he said. "Thank you," said Marion. "You too." He shrugged embarrassedly. "I'm glad you called me." Marion sighed. "We should have talked a long time ago, at least to decide when to file for divorce." Matthew frowned. "That's exactly what I wanted to talk about. It's great that we're on the same page here." He moved over and placed his hand gently on her arm. "Maybe we're being hasty," he said. "Maybe we shouldn't get divorced." "Should I not believe my ears?" Marion interrogated. "It was you who left me, wasn't it? You left a note and left without even saying goodbye to the kids. Didn't pick up the phone, didn't return messages. Just disappeared from our lives as if we were nothing to you and you hadn't lived with me for 15 years. Just came round one evening for tea." Matthew froze in embarrassment. "I'm sorry," he said. "I don't know what was wrong with me then. It was just some kind of madness. I was out of my mind." Marion sighed and released her hand to rub the bridge of her nose. "Was that it?" she asked. "I won't ask how and how much you cheated on me and why you decided to break up. I've known about it for a long time, but why couldn't you talk to me properly? Why did you abandon the children?" My husband lowered his eyes. "I know," he said. "It must have been a midlife crisis or something. It's just that at some point everything started to go crazy. Work, life, 3 kids. You're always with the kids and I'm in the background. I'm sick of the whole thing." "And your new love? Young, fun, carefree, childless?" she asked. "Sort of," he replied. "I lost my head then. I was afraid to tell you, even more so for the kids." "What changed?" she asked. Her husband moved closer. "I've realized in these months how much I've missed you and the children," he said. "And I want things to go back to the way they were." Marion shook her head slowly. "Nothing has changed," she said. "We'll get back together. In a couple of weeks you'll go off with another girl." "No, I won't do that," Matthew assured her. Marion sighed. "Jaroslav," she said, "I've had a lot of time to think about it, and I've realized that I can't forgive you, and my love for you has disappeared in that time too. I'm sorry, but I think we need to agree and decide when we go to file for divorce." Her husband's face suddenly changed. Marion suddenly saw clearly how his contrived tenderness and remorse came off. "Then we must talk about the division of property," he said in a harsh tone. Marion was surprised at this abrupt change of subject. In fact, it amused her. "Let's talk," she agreed. "Your car goes to you. My flat goes to me and the kids." Matthew shook his head. "No, let's sell it and split the money in half." Half Marion smiled. "I'm raising 3 kids on my own." Her husband was embarrassed, but he continued to stand his ground. "I was paying her mortgage. And you didn't work? Sitting on my back?" "Yes, because I was taking care of the house and the 3 kids. And now I'm paying the mortgage. You left me out of the blue and didn't even help the kids. You can't imagine what I've been through these past few months. Well, then we'll get back together. The husband returned to the old topic, and we won't have to share the flat. Marian sighed. No, Matthew, I've already said everything. So you have her husband's voice suddenly lowered like a snake's hiss. And who will need you alone with 3 children? Do you think any man but me will look at you? You stupid pet chicken. All you know how to do is cook soup. Marian felt tears coming from her eyes. It hurt her to hear such words from the father of her children, from the man she had loved for so many years. Let's not play innocent, her husband continued. You yourself will come to me on your knees. She will not, said a familiar male voice behind her. She did not have time to see what happened next. Only Matthew suddenly flew across the restaurant and collapsed to the floor. Robert shook the hand that had just collided with her husband's jaw. That was harsh, but I guess it was understandable, Jacob commented. Marian looked up and saw the supervisor. He looked as pleased as a cat for some reason. And you're here? She asked in amazement. Everyone heard, he said rather dryly. Matthew rose slowly from the floor. He pressed his palm to his bloody lips. We'll talk to you again, he threw to Marian. Wow, Jacob said admiringly. I should get out of the office more often. This place is fun. Shall we go home? Robert asked Marian. We will, she answered quietly, wiping away her tears. She was sent to Camila's kitchen to drink tea and calm down. We have something to discuss with the boss, Robert said. You get some rest. I'll call you. But Marian had no appetite. She was replaying in her head what had happened in the restaurant. What's going to happen now? Will she be fired? Probably get fired. Jacob hardly needs a problem employee getting his assistant into fights in the middle of the business center. And what about the flat? Do we have to split it in half? Where will she and the kids live then? What if she has to find a new job, even if she doesn't get fired today? The school issue hasn't been canceled. With so many problems, Marian's head was spinning. Marian, let's go, she raised her head. Robert's face didn't make it clear what judgment she had been given, so she stood up and obediently walked with him into the chief's office. What a show you put on today, Marian, Jacob said cheerfully. I'm sorry, said Marian. I didn't know that was going to happen. Well, it was kind of funny, the chief said. We have other things on the agenda. Marian squirmed. Now he was going to tell her everything. Do you want to continue working here? Jacob asked. Are you firing me? Marian asked. Do you want to? No, she answered quickly. Then I'm not. Good, he nodded. Soon your children will have to go to school. Yes, Marian confirmed cautiously. Jacob nodded. We'll get them a car and a driver, Robert said, to take them to school and bring them back. Marian opened her mouth. But why? She asked. Because I don't want to look for a new employee, the chief replied calmly. Thank you, Marian muttered. And we also need to solve the housing issue, Robert added. What about it? She wondered. Living in the outhouse in the winter is an option, Jacob said. It's warm and everything, but it's not very comfortable to run out in the cold for breakfast. So let's look at your new rooms. New rooms? Marian shook her head incredulously. There is an almost empty wing in the house, Robert explained. That's where we intend to put you. They left the study and went in the direction of rooms where Marian had never been before. What wing is this? She asked curiously. Jacob sighed. It's a part of my past, he said. I wanted to forget it, not remember it. But now I realize it's time to let go of the past and look to the future. They went into the largest room. This is the common room, said the chief. From here there are 4 bedrooms. There's enough for you. Marian walked around in surprise, looking round the rooms. Each room looked like a separate work of art. Beautiful, tastefully chosen furniture, Paintings on the walls, everything is thought out to the smallest detail. Except it looked like it hadn't been used in years. I wonder why, Marian thought. Suddenly she saw under the white cloth the outline of an object from her childhood. A grand piano. Marian exclaimed in amazement. "May I?" She turned to Jacob. He shrugged his shoulders. Marian carefully removed the white cloth that covered the instrument and ran her fingers over the keys. The instrument was a little distressed, but it was quite playable. Marian sat down. And she began to play the only tune she could remember, the one her mother had played, and many, many times since she was a little girl. The first few notes were difficult, but then her hands remembered it, and her fingers flew over the keys with ease. She sat with her back to Jacob and didn't see the change in the old man's face. First he stretched it out in astonishment. Then he turned his head, as if he wanted to make sure his hearing wasn't deceiving him. Then a tear rolled out of his right eye, then another from his left. Robert walked quietly over to the piano and stood facing Marian. He looked at her, and then suddenly he looked at the chief and couldn't hold back his astonished cry. "Jacob, what's the matter with you?" Marian immediately stopped, turned round in amazement. The old man was sobbing unashamedly and wiping his face with his shirt sleeve. "How do you know that tune?" he asked. "It was composed just for me." When Jacob was calmed down by the joint efforts of Marian and Robert, the chief asked for tea to be served to everyone. They returned to his office, and there the chief began his story. "When I met Vivian," he began, "I was still married to my third wife. She and I hardly ever saw each other even then. We only met to discuss how we were going to divide the property." He sighed and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Anyway, I was getting really tired of it. Work, divorce. One day I just walked out of a business meeting, let the driver go, and just went to the park, sat on a bench, and realized how nice it was. Just sunshine, birds singing, trees turning green. And then I saw her, Vivienne." Marian froze. Her heart was beating very fast. She couldn't believe what was happening. "So beautiful." "I've never seen such a beautiful woman," Jacob said dreamily. And then she looked at me and smiled. And I knew I was lost. Marian saw Robert looking at her and smiling. When he noticed her gaze, he seemed confused and started to look at his boss, who seemed to be oblivious to his surroundings. He was completely immersed in the memory of events that had taken place over 35 years ago. "My feet led me to it," Jacob continued. "And for the first time in my life I was scared. I was so afraid she'd refuse to meet me. I'd been with a lot of women, but none of them had ever struck such awe in me. At first sight, to my delight, she said yes." He smiled blissfully. "I've probably never been so happy. My wife and I were no longer living together. And so I brought Vivienne into this house and made this wing just for her. It's the sunniest side of the house. And the piano. She played for you?" "Yes," Marian interrupted him hoarsely. "Vivian taught music, and that tune you played she composed especially for me." "Why did you break up?" Marian asked. Another tear rolled down Jacob's face. "A fool, because he said calmly. I wanted to marry Vivian, and she refused me." "Why?" Marian asked. He sighed. "Said we were from different worlds, that she didn't want to turn into just a rich businessman's wife and stay at home." "That's how it is," muttered Marian. "Yes, I persuaded her. I told her she could do whatever she wanted and be herself. She refused and ended our relationship first." "Then why do you say it was your fault?" Marian asked. Jacob sighed. "Because I didn't insist. Because I gave in easily, because I didn't find out then that she was pregnant." Marian looked up at him. Jacob was looking straight at her. "Yes," he said calmly. "I'm sure you're my daughter." Marian stretched her legs blissfully and lifted her head, letting the sun shine on her face. She liked it here. The sea had always done her good, especially now that they got out there as a family every year. "Mum, did you see it?" Molly came running up to her. "I swam the fastest." "No, you didn't," shouted the middle son. It was obvious that he was tired and shutting down, but he was showing that he was inferior to his younger sister, who had been going swimming for 3 years and was performing well. He didn't mean to. "I just gave in to you," Alex stated. "Yeah, sure," the girl blurted out. She was already well aware of her own abilities and knew that her brother was swimming at full strength. Alex ran off resentfully towards the cabin. "And you had to tease him," Marion gently reprimanded him. "He wanted to compete. What am I supposed to do now? Go take a shower, we'll go to dinner soon." When her daughter ran away, she stretched, reluctantly got up from the sunbed and walked towards the cabin. She saw Stephen lying in the hammock, talking on the phone as usual. Talking to his girlfriend again, thought Marion. What's her name? It's either Jennifer or Ashley. He's all grown up now. "In half an hour," she said to her son, and he nodded, showing that he had heard his mother's words. It was cool in the spacious cabin. Jacob and Robert were sitting in the living room playing chess, as usual. "We're going home in 3 days, and you haven't even burned," Marion sighed. She gently ruffled her husband's hair and kissed her father on the cheek. "Don't worry, Marion," he replied. "We'll make it." "How is the sea?" "The water is warm," replied Marion. "How's the game?" "A draw," replied father with a sigh. "After all, Robert adopts from me not only the nuances of managing the company, but also the ability to play chess." Robert smiled. "I learned from the best, Jacob," he said to his father-in-law. "Checkmate to you, by the way." "Oh, you," Jacob cursed. Grandfather Molly appeared out of nowhere. "What does that mean?" she asked. Jacob coughed embarrassedly. "It means, young lady," he said with feigned sternness, "that you're not legally allowed to say that for another 8 years. "We have worse swearing at school," Molly said, laughing and running off to the shower. "Change schools," Jacob said firmly. "I won't have my only granddaughter using that kind of language." Marion walked over to her father and kissed him on the top of his head. "Then you'll have to change Grandpa," she said, "because he's the one Molly hears it most often." "That's a fair point," sighed her father. "That's a fair point," Dad sighed. "I'll try not to swear so much." Marion smiled and looked out to sea. Through the transparent panoramic wall of their cottage, she could see the huge red sun slipping into the sunset. "It's nice," she said, turning to Robert, who came over and hugged her from behind. "I always feel good with you," replied her husband. "Me too," said Marion. "And I'm perfectly happy."